gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Lisa. Sometimes I'm gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Lisa. Sometimes I'm gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining. Then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father, would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today we have a very special stream. Major shout out goes to our brother AC for sponsoring another great topic in which we're going to be diving into Scottish common sense realism, a kind of interesting, often forgotten sort of philosophical school coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment, in which the main person we're going to be talking about is the work of Thomas Reid. Now, there's a handful of other Scottish realists that were pretty important. I've put together a document that really goes over the whole contours of Scottish common sense realism and why it's important, how Thomas Reid is responding specifically to Hume, David Hume, and Rene Descartes. And then the very last section is talking about the comparison between sort of Eastern Orthodox, our paradigm, our framework, our epistemology and metaphysics, and how it differs with common sense, Scottish common sense realism. And you know, I got a few videos we're going to be playing today. Some of you are going to be familiar with Greg Bonson. He was the one of the originators of the transcendental argument for God, if you will. Now, not transcendental arguments as we've talked about with Aristotle and things like that. Kant's often labeled. Kant's going to come up today, but Bonson has a video I'm going to show you where he really takes aim. He does not like Scottish common sense realism whatsoever. And I have another gentleman that I think is actually very enlightening. I had not listened to a lot of his stuff until more recently, and you guys may already be aware. His name's Professor Dan Robinson. Unfortunately, he's passed away in 2018, and we're going to be playing a whole section of him talking about Thomas Reid's response in the role of common sense realism to David Hume. So that is going to be about 52 minutes. We'll probably speed it up. He speaks a little slow. We'll probably speed it up to about 1.25, although I've been listening a little bit faster and you can still get through it very legibly. But because of the criticisms I always get for always speeding up the videos, we're going to at least do 1.25. But he has a course that he actually offered at Oxford specifically on the work of Thomas Reid. And Dan Robinson was a Catholic philosopher who really specialized in the philosophy of psychology, really. And that's really what we're going to be getting at today with the thing on common sense. What is common sense? How is Thomas Reid defining common sense? What do you mean there's a philosophical school defined by the utilization of common sense? And so to really get into the topic, we first have to contextualize the state of sort of Enlightenment philosophy. And this, I have a little philosophy notebook. That's what this is right here. This is my show notes outside the documents that I make for you guys. But this is a book that I have specifically on different philosophers and schools of philosophy. You can see I have like, philosophy of language, Wittgenstein, this type of stuff. And it's just kind of overview notes that if ever I need to look back on something to grab the terminology or see what the main arguments are, what the central thrust is, I'll refer back to my little philosophy notebook here. And what I wanted to begin with is a little diagram that I got from a gentleman you guys may have heard of. He has the best philosophy lectures. If you're looking for, like, you're not in university, but you'd love to have a sort of university level introduction to various philosophies, you got to follow or at least look at the Arthur Holmes series on the history of philosophy from Wheaton College. I'm going to share this link right now. We're going to be pulling it up later. I didn't plan on actually playing his video, although I have it pulled up, but he was an American Christian philosopher at Wheaton College, and he has a lecture series of 2 full semesters. It has 81 videos covering the history of philosophy. It's phenomenal. It is the preeminent free access to a sort of university lecture on philosophy. He begins from the pre-Socratics and ends, what is this last one on? Philosophy of language, and then the philosophy of today and tomorrow. And I think these were done in the 90s. But great little series. I have the whole playlist. I just shared the link with you guys. but I'll refer back to it. Anyways, I got this from him going over a bit of Kant's work, and you see this right here, this little diagram here. May be hard to read, but you see how it says, let's see, right there. It says Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Descartes, was that Spinoza, Leibniz, and then Kant is kind of in that intersection. What this is describing is what will become basically the two schools of philosophy. Up here, you have the empiricists, John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume, and David Hume being the ultimate skeptic. Here you have the, Descartes was obviously a skeptic too, but this side is dependent upon the sort of dogmatic metaphysics and what will become the school of idealism. So the sort of continental philosophy, the European philosophy that focuses on a phenomenology and methodology. And so I bring this up because Thomas Reid is responding specifically to three things that have emerged due to the conversation of these. So the Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, this is going to lead into what we would consider the schools of empiricism. Now, these are already empiricists. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, you can categorize them as the empiricists, and these as sort of the idealists down here. And the consequences post-Kant is that they're essentially, you're going to have the German idealist, which leads into phenomenology, which we consider sort of continental philosophy. And then you have 19th century British empiricism. So I bring this up. Why? Because what Thomas Reid is trying to do, and what the Scottish Enlightenment that really occurred between like 1740 and 1820 is sort of the general idea, is that he is trying to account for really three things in conversation: the reliability and the knowability of causality, the external world, and the continuity of the self. These three things is really the impetus for Thomas Reid to respond to the immense skepticism, because what we have with John Locke is, if you're familiar with John Locke, very important thinker. He kind of put forth the idea of the tabula rasa, right? That we are like blank slates. And as blank slates, what we are is the impression of the phenomenal world. So out here, these create impressions. And so what we actually have access to is only our minds, right? So he rejects the innate ideas of Descartes, meaning that the human, because Descartes was still part of the dogmatic metaphysical school, the traditional metaphysics, he believed that certain things are sort of imbued into human nature, like mathematics and the belief in God. And Locke is saying, no, we don't have these innate ideas within our head. What we have are ideas, or what is considered in philosophy representationalism, and that these ideas are representative of the phenomenal world of which we don't actually have full knowledge of. So Locke calls into question the external world, and Berkeley follows with an even extreme response where he denies material substance as actually existing because of its unknowability, and that all we have is the representational ideas in our head. This is what we have direct awareness to. And so Berkeley, he rejects Locke's distinction between ideas versus external objects and just says it's all ideas. We really don't know about the external world. Well, David Hume, following in this line, remember that line that says Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Hume then comes along, and he has what we would consider sort of radical skepticism. And he says that the self, external reality, causation, these things aren't even knowable. He rejects all dogmatic metaphysics and claims that the self is really just a bundle of sense impressions, and then what we have is ideas. So Hume agrees with the Locke and Berkeleyan school in the sense that all we have are these ideas. The only thing you have direct awareness of are the mental ideas that exist in your head. And what shapes those ideas, like Locke, is he's claiming it's the impression of the experiential world, right? We don't know it in and of itself. This is also carried in with Immanuel Kant, but But what we do have is the mental impressions these things create. Rejects Locke's material and mental substances. He rejects Berkeley's reliance on God, because George Berkeley, in his extreme idealism, he makes a sort of theistic claim, which Thomas Reid is always also going to make today, is that it's really Scottish common sense realism is really a theistic justification on what we were going to call common sense, or what he also refers to, and I think is more appropriate because common sense already comes with a sort of prepackaged understanding, what he calls natural beliefs, and that man is constructed with a series of natural beliefs that are first principles, meaning that they don't need to be justified or proven rationally, because the utilization of reason depends upon these first principles. And these are things like laws of logic, mathematics, the existence of nature, material things, causal connections, the use of memory, free will, moral principles, the external reality. Thomas Reid saying, no, these things are not just ideas. We don't have just direct awareness of the representations. Representationalism is what is referred to in philosophy. What we have is a direct awareness. And this is why Scottish common sense realism is often referred to as epistemological monism, because it's rejecting the dualism of the external world and then the mental world. Thomas Reid is saying that our mental world is actually having direct awareness of the external world, and that these representational ideas, they don't have secondary qualities, right? So a smell. So your concept of a rose, yes, we have direct awareness of the mental representation, but these representations don't have secondary qualities. So the smell that you acquire from a rose has to do with the external object actually existing. And he's making this argument that these are natural beliefs. These are what he would consider common sense beliefs that we are endowed with by being made by the Creator. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that sounds kind of consistent with a Christian framework. And it is. Most Scottish realists were Presbyterians. And they tried to imbue the Enlightenment movement of rationality and empiricism with a sort of Presbyterian Protestantism that prioritizes God. And this is why Thomas Reid is taking such serious aim at Hume, because Hume is the ultimate skeptic and he's an atheist. Meanwhile, many of the Scottish realists are theists, they're Protestants. And so Hume is grounding empiricism in the psychological habits of natural tendencies. So Hume is an empiricist, meaning the best thing that we can come to know is through empirical investigation. But really, we don't know the thing that we're empirically investigating, because all it is a sense impression that's creating and then imprinting upon these mental representations. Reid is a foundationalist. Reid believes in first principles. Reid believes that things like the laws of logic and mathematics and the external world, that these are given, and that if we're trying to just focus on rational justification of these, that it's ultimately not going to work, and it's not necessary, because God made us in a way in which we have access to these types of things. So Reid is responding to the skepticism of traditional metaphysics, the skepticism of mind and matter, the skepticism of teleology, the skepticism of ontology and essences, the skepticism of knowledge, that, again, sense impressions create ideas, and the only thing that you and I have direct awareness of are our ideas. He's saying absolutely not. And so we're going to be talking about how Scottish realism is what is often referred to as a presentational perception, as opposed to the representation that we have a sort of mental representation of the external world. Thomas Reid saying, no, it's a presentation of the reality of the external world. And objects are directly presented to consciousness. So when you smell a rose and hold a rose, you are having a direct awareness. Often this presentational perception is described as direct realism. This is why it's called Scottish realism. Scottish common sense being these innate mental natural beliefs that we're endowed with by God, is how we have a realistic understanding of the external world, the realistic understanding of reality itself. And direct awareness is also referred to as like direct realism. And this is in opposition to phenomenalism. What is phenomenalism? The study of the mental phenomenon. So the impression of phenomena out here, phenomenalism has to do with this understanding that it's just phenomenology is the study of the mental phenomenon. That's because that's all that we have direct awareness of. And so ideas for Thomas Reid, and we're going to go into more depth and more detail here regarding this, that ideas are signs rather than representations. They are signs rather than objects of knowledge, right? So the thing that we know is not the idea. It's not the idea that we know. It's actually the presentation of the reality of the external world. And so common sense has these natural beliefs, as I said, laws of logic, mathematics, the existence of nature, material objects, causal connections, memory, free will, moral principles. And so when we get into the ethics section, we're going to see that he's going to make an argument for ethics based on these first principles, which the skeptic tradition is denying first principles, because can it be proven rationally? Can it be proven? And rational means the answer is no, because like the tag argument, there are certain things that are necessary for knowledge itself. And this is really what Thomas Reid's claiming. So as I said, many of you may be listening to this and think, man, why is the Scottish common sense realism so demonized and kind of mocked, as we'll see by Greg Bonson? Because much of it seems to accord with my Orthodox Christian world or Christian worldview. And I would say, yes, it does. There's actually a lot of overlap with Scottish realism and Orthodoxy. I have a handful of points in which we are in divergence, a different paradigm. The reason why this has been sort of a kind of has been mocked or hasn't really attained a high prestige in philosophy is that it's many critics would say that it's epistemologically naive, that all he's doing, what Thomas Reid is doing, is saying the whole skeptical tradition is he's just saying, okay, well, if you believe that, then you're kind of in a place in which you're not able to make any truth claims. Clearly, these are just mental faculties or natural beliefs, a common sense dimension of human existence that we're imbued with. And they're saying, well, that really doesn't answer the question, Thomas. And so, and this is going to be Greg Bonson. He's going to be pointing out that you're not really answering the objection by rational means by just appealing to common sense and natural beliefs, because that's really what it is. He's just saying that, look, we're made by God. He's a Presbyterian. We have these natural beliefs. This is how we have to have these to even come to any sort of knowledge claim. And they're saying, okay, weak sauce. All you're doing is appealing that we're made by God. But yet the whole system of Scottish realism is within the Scottish Enlightenment, which is in the Enlightenment tradition, generally speaking, which is trying to prove things without the appeal to revelation and scripture. So this is where we're going to diverge with Scottish realism, is that orthodoxy, and this is where when you hear myself or Dyer or FDA talk about tag, is that we appeal to revelation. Thomas Reid is not appealing to revelation. Now, in a sense, he is, but really he's just appealing to, well, God made us this way. And this is why it has to be this way. This is why many schools in philosophy are very critical of Scottish realism for that purpose. So he claims that these natural beliefs, common sense, are unanalytical intrinsic assumptions natural to humans. They're not artificial and they're not socially constructed, right? Mathematics is not socially constructed. The recognition of the external world is not socially constructed. These, he's saying, are intrinsic to human nature, and they're unanalytic, meaning you can't provide a rational explanation for them. They're the beginning point. They are the first principles. And so God made us, he claims God made us in such a way to naturally possess common sense, natural beliefs. That's the argument. And so he's responding to Hume regarding human freedom and claiming that humans have direct and intuitive knowledge of our own causal agency. As we've talked about before, David Hume is essentially the most important, not that I'm part of the Humean school, obviously, you know, but in regards to English philosophers, I've heard many people make the claim that he is the most important philosopher in the English language, David Hume. And I would say he is the most consistent skeptic and the most consistent atheist. And so what we've talked before in regards to what kind of awoke Kant out of his slumber when we talked about Kantian metaphysics, and I did a huge stream with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias on metaphysics. Check that out if you guys aren't familiar. But it's this idea that David Hume says we cannot empirically prove that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. We can make that assumption. That is a belief that we have. And that's really what the Humean doctrine comes down to, is that we have these sense experiences that create these ideas in our head, this representationalism, which is all we have direct awareness of. And we can make assumptions about the world, but can you know it? Do you know it as a fact? And his answer is no. Obviously, you can't. You can't empirically prove that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. We assume it's going to based on customs and habits. And so he's going to say that humans have direct intuitive knowledge of our own causal agency. So Thomas Reid's going to attack Hume's criticism of causation by saying, look, I as a human individual can decide to kick the desk. I can decide to pour a glass of water. And so when it comes to this argument that we can't actually perceive the sequential order of causation or empirically improve it, Reid's saying, okay, maybe at a large abstract level, he's not going to directly engage with. He's going to say, look, me as an individual human, I can choose to cause something to happen. And if that's the case, he's making a larger case for God. Well, there is then a causal chain of events regarding creation. And he makes the claim that we ourselves as moral agents have causal ability. So whether the world is determined or not, we have direct awareness to choose between alternative reasons or motives. And so I'm going to speak a little bit more to all this stuff in just a second. We're going to go over my document. But here's a few things that I think are interesting that differentiate common sense realism, Scottish realism, from orthodoxy. The few points that I kind of noted was epistemology. So the Scottish realism school is tied to empiricism and rational knowledge, self-evident truth beginning on these first principles, these natural beliefs, and then claiming that through empiricism and rationality, we can come to true knowledge. Where orthodoxy appeals to divine revelation. Now, we wouldn't disagree with Thomas Reid saying that, he's saying that we're made by God in a certain way to have these natural beliefs. We as Orthodox would say, yeah, the Imago Dei, we're absolutely made in the image of God. We have access to this noetic realm to higher knowledge claims, but we wouldn't begin with empiricism and rationality. We would begin with divine revelation and scripture, and then we would move to rational theological concepts of explicating the logos based on scripture, tradition, and then, of course, the Imago Dei related again to divine revelation. And so you can see there's a subtle distinction there. It's the beginning point of emphasis that is going to differentiate the Orthodox tradition with the Scottish realist tradition. Another one is metaphysics. What Thomas Reid is doing, because dogmatic metaphysics is under attack here, traditional metaphysics is under attack. And Thomas Reid isn't going to come to the defense of dogmatic metaphysics. What he's going to use instead is these common sense natural beliefs. So instead of defending traditional metaphysics, what is metaphysics? The understanding of being. So how beings change or maintain things, human essence, human nature, animal nature, right? Instead of defending traditional metaphysics, Thomas Reid's going to say, no, this is common sense natural beliefs that we're endowed with by the Creator, and that these are empirical and material forces. Orthodoxy is going to rely more on dogmatic traditional metaphysics in relationship to revelation and this understanding of the relationship between the Creator and the created world. So our metaphysics, again, the starting point is different. Thomas Reid is rooted within this Enlightenment phenomenon that's happening in philosophy, trying to root everything within empirical and rational means. We're going to have different understandings of anthropology, because of the emphasis for orthodoxy is that we come to knowledge claims and more knowledge claims through the process of theosis, through the cleansing of our noetic faculties, where for him, he certainly believes in objective morality. He makes this explicit in regards to David Hume, because David Hume really does have a sort of ethical subjectivism. But he's going to root it back into common sense, natural beliefs, and say that anybody who has a conscience, who then reflects on that conscience, would know that there's first principles and there's objective moral standards that are derived from nature. Now, we wouldn't derive any sort of natural theology for our understanding of anthropology or ethics. These are revealed. These are transcendent. And so the emphasis within the Orthodox world is through theosis. It's by becoming like Christ that we actually can attain a better understanding of the phenomenal world and the spiritual world, right? The cleansing of your noetic faculties is what gives you eyes to see. And this is the relationship with Christ. As Christ here heals the blind in Scripture, he's also healing our noetic blindness as we become more like him and are filled with those uncreated energies. And then ethics, again, it's kind of the difference is Scottish realism is about natural law. Orthodoxy is going to be focused on a sort of transcendent morality and the process of theosis. And then faith and reason, Scottish realism is going to put a primacy on rationality, where in orthodoxy, rationality is not negated. We don't believe rationality is wrong, but rationality is subordinate to faith and revelation, right? So rationale, it's like we have revelation, we have faith in that revelation, and then rationality is the lower, the bottom rung of that process of moving back towards God and knowledge itself. So it's revelation, faith, and then rationality within the Orthodox framework, as opposed to just beginning with rationalism, which the Scottish common sense realism school does. So I have more, again, I have like 2 pages of notes here on Scottish realism that it'd be kind of boring if I just read them to you, although I'm very tempted to, and I have a document that I put together. Let's see how long that document is. It's 14 pages, and I don't want to read that whole thing to you, but you know what? Why don't we just go ahead and start getting into it? I need to do some housekeeping real quick. So smash that like, guys, for everybody who just showed up. Major appreciation to you guys. God bless everyone. And let me just promote things real quick, and then we won't be distracted anymore throughout today's stream. So got to do some quick housekeeping, guys. If you want to support my work, please do so by becoming a website member. You get 2 months free if you purchase for a full year membership. I have a whole video library in the show notes of today, which I'm about to show you guys, these 14 pages. All the show notes are always available. My documents are available for website members for $5 a month, $50 for a year. You get 2 months free. And if you'd really want to get a lifetime membership, we have a lifetime membership. It's $1,000, but I don't plan on going anywhere for the next decade. And so it's a great value. If you enjoy my work, my research, the members videos and documents for a lifetime membership, you will always have access to my website. Also, if anybody is interested in signing up for a one-on-one session, you can do so with this link right here. I'd greatly appreciate that. And we can talk about anything that you desire. And again, a major thank you goes out to AC for sponsoring today's stream on Scottish Common Sense Realism. If you also have a topic you would like to sponsor, please do so with this link right here. AC's been a huge supporter, and I greatly appreciate you, brother, and all the support that you've given me and supporting my work. And I just want to say thank you. And God bless you and your family, man. I truly appreciate all the streams that you've sponsored and supported me with. So God bless you, bro. Really appreciate it. And then last thing, if you guys are in the market for any Orthodox items. Oh, also, don't forget, guys, if you're interested in all the eschatology stuff, go to eschatonvigil.org and become a member there if you'd like to get access to digital copies of all the translations we're doing regarding various saints and elders prophesying or giving advice or tips or understandings about the end times. You can become a website member and get all that stuff available. digitally, or you can go to the shop and purchase. That is always appreciated too. And then last thing, if you're in the market for some Orthodox item, be it icons, prayer ropes, incense, check out orthodoxdepot.com. Orthodoxdepot.com. Use promo code COTEL. You'll get 10% off, and you'll be able to help me out as well as a great Orthodox company here in the Midwest. So check out orthodoxdepot.com. All right. So thank you guys for letting me shill for a second. Now let's get into the some of the work here. Now I'm going to go through this whole thing a little bit more. I've already sent AC this document that I put together. And so as we see, here are the 5 core features of Scottish realism. And I'm going to, as we go through this, I'm actually going to read some of my notes that I took for my little philosophy notebook here. But it's common sense as a foundation for knowledge. It's direct realism, rejection of skepticism, pragmatic approach to philosophy. This is one of the reasons why Scottish common sense realism is going to be incredibly influential in many of the founding fathers of America, is because if we looked at that, remember that graph that I showed you of the empiricist and the idealist and how this leads into phenomenology and empiricism, that pragmatism is really the sort of outgrowth of Scottish realism, because pragmatism is essentially just finding, what the pragmatic solution is. But this appeal to common sense and natural beliefs is you can see it as a sort of natural step to a sort of pragmatic philosophy, be it of the Charles Sanders Peirce, William James type school, stuff like that. But it's responding, as I said, Scottish realism arose in response to the radical skepticism of David Hume, who questioned the existence of causality, the external world, and the continuity of the self. Right? We can't know the causal connections of things. The external world cannot be proven because all we know are the sense impressions that create ideas within our mind. And then the continuity of self, David Hume argues that because he's rejecting dogmatic metaphysics, he's rejecting the idea of a static essence. And he's claiming what you are is a bundle of sense impressions and ideas created by those impressions. You are a bundle that changes throughout time. Hume's philosophy was deeply unsettling to his contemporaries because it threatened the foundations of morality, religion, and science, what Thomas Reid is trying to, in a sense, defend. In this context, Scottish realists sought to defend common sense beliefs against such skepticism. The movement was deeply influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment. As I said, roughly around sort of 1740 to 1820 is the Scottish Enlightenment, a period marked by advances in science, literature, and philosophy, and a focus on practical human concerns. Scottish realism was also rooted in the educational reforms and intellectual climate of Scottish universities, which emphasize empirical observation and moral philosophy, but specifically within a sort of Protestant context. So when you talk about the Scottish Enlightenment, a feature that sort of differentiates it from other Enlightenment movements is that it's very explicitly Christian. They believe that education, rationality, science, that these are great things in of themselves, only if it's under the banner of a sort of Christian theistic framework. And one of the criticisms that is leveled at Thomas Reid and the common sense school is that common sense can be different based in a different geographical or historical time frame. So the context, and I think that this could be true, although I think Thomas Reid would be willing to defend Christianity as a paradigm in which gives forth a rational understanding of these common sense natural beliefs. But other people would say, Aboriginal man, people that lived in various cultures, do they have the same common sense first principle faculties that you and I have? And I think that's actually a pretty good argument. I would say, do they have access to that? Yes, they do. I think everybody is built with these, because the Imago Dei, everybody has the Imago Dei, but do all cultures emphasize these sort of philosophical first principles to the same degree? No. So I think it becomes a little bit more obvious, yes, within a Christian context, a Christian society. But I think the criticism that common sense, or what they levy as these natural beliefs, are they universal amongst all cultures? Probably not. Probably not. But again, I think if Thomas Reid was here to defend himself, he would defend it based on sort of Christian revelation and the importance of Christianity. So, as I was talking about, this is epistemological monism. So, because Thomas Reid is trying to say that the external world and the mental signs, not innate ideas, these signs that we have in our mind, these go together as one, as opposed to the unknowable external world and then the direct awareness of our sort of representational ideas. That is a dualism. And that dualism is central to Descartes, it's central to Hume, Locke, Berkeley. It's the same dualism. So Thomas Reid's common sense realism is epistemologically monistic, and he posits the independent existence of material objects and qualities against phenomenalism and idealism. This is a direct refutation against phenomenalism and idealism. And he believes that we can have true knowledge of that independent external reality. And so, again, ideas are signs rather than objects of knowledge, and that ideas are not intermediaries between us and the external world. This is basically the claim, is that the representationalist school, be it we'll just use Hume here or Locke, it's that all we have access to are these representations, and that these are intermediaries between all experience that we have. So no matter if you're looking the sun or smelling the rose, the idea of the rose, the idea of the smell is actually what you have awareness of. Thomas Reid saying, no, absolutely not. He's claiming that we have common sense, natural beliefs, and I want to differentiate it from the sensus communis of Aristotle. Aristotle talks about common sense, but not in the way that's just common. That would he talks about common sense, not in a common sense way that is common today. Aristotle's talking about the communis sensus as the collection of senses that we have, the common senses. Thomas Reid is saying, more in line with what we would understand as common sense, is that they are natural, unanalytical assumptions about the world that are necessary for knowledge itself. And he wants to appeal to the intrinsic nature of things. And he uses a theistic justification that they exist this way because we're made by God. That's his argument. And so natural beliefs depend upon the intrinsic nature of human beings. Thomas Reid is not negating the existence of metaphysics or essences or natures. He agrees with it. He's not making a defense, though, for dogmatic metaphysics per se. He's making a defense for common sense natural beliefs that are given to us by being made by God. And so natural beliefs are not artificial or socially constructed, as David Hume argued. That because David Hume also talks about beliefs. He doesn't believe, David Hume rejects innate ideas that mathematics is imprinted upon the mind of man. Hume rejects this, and he says we come to beliefs, and in the same way, Reid's saying the same thing, but Reid is saying that these beliefs are real and that they're actually true knowledge. So Reid says God made us in such a way that we would, in the course of nature, come to certain natural beliefs. And this is later developed by Charles Hodge in regards to sort of theistic arguments by some of the realists concerning the teleological argument for God and the cosmological argument for God, again, based within this common sense structure. And so these natural beliefs, like I said, mathematics, laws of logic, existence of nature, material objects, causal connections, memory. That's actually a big one for Reid, that memory is actually real and reliable. Free will, moral principles. Reid is saying these are not relationships between atomistic, discrete ideas, but foundational beliefs in natural processes. They are psychologically necessary. And he has this quote that I heard from Arthur Holmes. It's hilarious, talking about Descartes. And, Descartes, the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes begins by sitting in a room being totally skeptical of his own body and his own existence and coming to, like, what is the ultimate foundation of knowledge? For him, it's that he's a thinking thing, right? Reid has a comment on Descartes. He says,
A man who doubts his own existence is unfit to be reasoned with as just a man who thinks he's made of glass, and says that says reason won't fix such extravagance of thought. There is a underlying psychological problem. So he's saying there must be a psychological problem with Descartes, or somebody who would go to such extreme skepticism as to deny their own existence, because it violates our common sense. It violates our natural beliefs of reality itself. And so G.E. Moore in the 20th century will speak. He will try to sort of bridge the gap between Scottish common sense realism with his own sort of realism. And he talks about how these natural beliefs. Now, G.E. Moore is not theistic. So he's, unlike Thomas Reid, he's not grounding these sort of innate natural beliefs in a theistic justification. But G.E. Moore talks about how these natural beliefs are logically necessary. Okay, so if A or not A, if not A is a contradiction, then it's false and A must be true, right? Basic logic here. So a contradiction to natural beliefs is self-contradictory. And he makes the point of the philosopher's paradox. He talks about how, let's say a philosopher claimed that time is not real. Time is a sort of mental construction, which some of these skeptics actually do. Time is a mental construction of these representational ideas, and it's not real. He would say then the philosopher would contradict himself when doing anything in a sequential order, right? So anything that has a antecedent, that this would be this process of acting in a sequential order would be self-contradictory to the claim that time is an illusion. And therefore G.E. Moore, and really what Thomas Reid is also highlighting, is the difference between theory and practice. And common sense realism is trying to focus more on the practice, the practical relationship of philosophy and the way in which we engage in the world, and highlighting that it's the problem is these philosophers who create theories that are devoid of the way in which they actually engage in the world. And so Thomas Reid talks about these signs. Ideas are signs, right? And he says that God has created signs for us to come to knowledge claims. These are such as sensations are signs. So the sensation is not sense impression that we can't totally know. He's saying, no, that's a sign based on the way that God constructed us. Memory, the ability to remember something that you did. I remember I got up this morning. I remember I already took a shower. That this is another mental sign. These aren't ideas in the representational sense. And he believes that the imagination is also a sign. Now, not all signs can be true, because we can come up with ideas that may be false, but he's arguing that they're signs as opposed to this representational worldview, that's all that we know. And so let's kind of move through our document here, and this stuff should make a little bit more sense. So common sense Scottish realists argued that certain fundamental truths are self-evident and universally accepted by all sane human beings. So you can, again, get back to Reid's critique of of Descartes. A man who denies his own existence must have a psychological problem. And that's kind of it's humorous, but that's how Reid frames it using the common sense. These include beliefs in the existence of the external world, the reality of other minds. So attacking solipsism, the reliability of memory and perception, and the principle of causality. Now, it's a direct realism because we have direct awareness, direct knowledge of the real world, of the external world. They advocated for a form of direct realism, asserting that we perceive objects in the world directly, not through the mediation of ideas or representations. This was in contrast to the representationalism of philosophers like Locke and Berkeley, as I mentioned, and the rejection of skepticism. So skepticism, particularly Hume's, was seen as an intellectual dead end. Scottish realists believed that such skepticism could not be consistently maintained, and it was refuted by the very act of living and reasoning. And then it was a pragmatic approach to philosophy. Scottish realism emphasized the practical implications of philosophy for everyday life, moral decision-making, and scientific inquiry. it sought to bridge the gap between abstract philosophical speculation and the lived experience of individuals. Again, as I said, the difference between theory and practice. The theory and practice. Common sense realism is about bridging these things together. And then human faculties and the reliability. The movement placed great trust in human cognitive faculties, including perception, memory, and reasoning. These faculties were not seen as naturally oriented toward truth and as providing a reliable foundation for knowledge. And so I could see somebody making the claim, well, what about like an optical illusion? What about when you see something and it's not actually what you think it is? This was an argument made by skeptics to highlight the fallibility of our cognitive faculties. Well, Thomas Reid takes the opposing standpoint and says the fact that you have to find specific instances in which we are that an optical illusion or that our cognitive faculties are faulty highlights the exception, not the rule. The rule is that on the vast majority of instances, you are directly perceiving accurate information and knowledge about the external world. Epistemological monism. And that you have to come up with these scenarios in which our perception is deceived highlights that those are exceptions, not the rule itself. And so central figures, as we said, is Thomas Reid. He's the one that we're going to be talking about the most. He is the most prominent figure associated with realism. His major works include The Human Mind, The Principles of Common Sense, Essays on the Intellectual Powers of Man, and laid the foundation for the school. His contributions, he articulated the principles of common sense, emphasizing certain basic beliefs and foundational and self-evident, developed the theory of perception as direct realism, rejecting ideal theory or representationalism, and criticized Hume's skepticism and the Cartesian model of epistemology, arguing for the trustworthiness of human cognitive faculties. Douglas Stewart, he was the student of Reid, and his contributions were he advocated for the application of common sense philosophy and moral political theory, and he's going to be influential in regards to some of the founding fathers, and some of the founding fathers put Thomas Reid in the same category as Aristotle. Now, nobody in modern philosophy is typically going to do that, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to play, and we're going to play one lecture. It's like 52 minutes of Dan Robinson, because he is one of the few people I could find that really Steelman's Reid. Now, Dan Robinson was a Catholic philosopher, actually very, very sharp. I just bought he has a book that's kind of a sort of renowned in the world of psychology called The Intellectual History of Psychology. I just purchased that today myself. It might be something, if you like the topic, might be something you guys also want to look into. But Dan Robinson is actually going to Steelman Reid, and Dan Robinson's a substance dualism, that has to do with like philosophy of mind, that mental substance and material substance are two different things. That's substance dualism. He was a substance dualist. But he does a great job. He's one of the few people I could find that really kind of Steelmans and tries to support Reid against Hume, because it's very common now to sort of chastise and mock Scottish common sense realism on its failure to rationally defend these first principles. They're just saying that's how God made us, right? This is the criticism. But Stewart also emphasized the pedagogical value of Scottish realism, making a core part of university education, which was also the case here in America. I saw Dan Robinson. I have a lecture. We're not going to be watching this, but he has like an hour lecture on the influence of Scottish realism on America and the founding fathers, and highlighted that by the time of the Civil War, there may have been, what was it, like 100 and some, I'm ballpark it. Don't quote me specifically, but let's say it's like 150 universities and colleges, or 200 universities and colleges in the United States. And like 94 of them were all founded by Presbyterians because of the influence of Scottish realism and this belief that Christianity, Protestant Christianity, rationalism, and education and science were the ways in which we actually have true progress. And in a way, not so much of a focus on novelty, but in a true advancement of knowledge in light of Christian doctrines. And so we're not going to get in James Beattie. William Hamilton. These are other important Scottish realists if you guys want to look into their stuff. Beattie defended the existence of objective truth and common sense against philosophical skepticism, argued for the compatibility of reason and religion, countering Hume's critiques. And William Hamilton explored the boundaries of human cognition and the implications of metaphysical inquiry, and critiqued both empiricism and rationalism, seeking a balanced epistemology. So you can see that even though as a paradigm, we have a lot of differences with Scottish common sense realism, but as an Enlightenment philosophical project, it's one that, in a sense, we can kind of get behind. We can kind of root for them attacking some of the radical skeptics, but do they complete the project in the rational terms that the Enlightenment project set forth? I'll leave that up to you. So what are the central points? The defense of common sense, opposition to Hume's skepticism, relevance of science and morality, and the influence on American philosophy. Scottish realism profoundly influenced American thinkers, especially in the development of 19th century educational and philosophical traditions. Many American universities incorporated Scottish realist ideas into their curricula. And so why was it so influential in America? This was pretty interesting for me to dive into. It became highly influential, as we already said. One reason was for its compatibility with American pragmatism and individualism, right? Because if we're talking about common sense and natural beliefs, we're talking about the individual and its constitution as made by God. So it has a practical orientation. Scottish realism emphasized the reliability of common sense and natural human faculties, which resonated with America's practical, pragmatic ethos. It appealed to a nation focused on solving real-world problems, building institutions, and advancing science and education. And it had a democratic appeal. The philosophy's emphasis on universal common sense as a foundation for knowledge was seen as inherently democratic. It suggested that ordinary people, not just elite intellectuals, could grasp fundamental truths about the world. And that was the thing that Thomas Reid was highlighting, is that these common sense natural beliefs allow the farmer, the rural farmer, to know the world to the same extent as the erudite, highly educated philosopher. And in fact, I think Reid would probably say that these highly educated, erudite philosophers focus too much on the theory. They're focused way too much in their mind. And in fact, they actually lead philosophy astray. And then common sense realism was integrated into the American education, moral philosophy focus. Scottish realism provided a robust foundation for teaching ethics and moral philosophy, aligning with religious and moral concerns of early American educators. The Scottish realists like Thomas Reid, Douglas Stewart, and James Beattie were used extensively in American classrooms, influencing generations of students. And then influential thinkers, prominent American intellectuals, including theologians like Jonathan Edwards and philosophers like Francis Bowen, adopted and adapted Scottish realist ideas. Compatibility with religious beliefs. Obviously, Scottish common sense realism would be compatible with any sort of Protestant Christianity, which would also make it very suitable in the American context in which we had so much sort of religious diversity. And the support for scientific inquiry. Scottish realism emphasized the reliability of perception and reasoning, which provided a philosophical justification for the burgeoning scientific advancement of 19th century America. And the philosophy's grounding in empiricism, tempered by its commitment to common sense, aligned well with the experimental and observational methods of science. Now, the intellectual and philosophical critiques of Scottish realism, and this is what I was highlighting, is this is partly why it's no longer really in favor in the academy, is that they would claim its naivete regarding common sense. Critics argue that common sense is not a reliable or philosophically robust foundation for knowledge. Cultural variability, which I think you could probably make a good, you look at Papua New Guinea and the tribes there that are engaged in cannibalism. Now, Thomas Reid would say, from his context within Scotland, he'd say, well, if you're engaging in cannibalism, you are, if you reflect on your conscience, you are violating that normative ethical first principle that is, he would say, imbued to us through nature itself, and you are performing an unnatural act. It's unnatural. Now, do the people in Papua New Guinea believe it's unnatural? Probably not. And so this is a contemporary critique that I think is still probably accurate regarding common sense realism. subjectivity, philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who disdained Thomas Reid. I mean, he didn't disdain him, but he thought that the appeal to common sense and natural beliefs in regarding David Hume was lackluster for an Enlightenment philosopher at best. He thought it was a laughable response. And this is why Hume goes in, or Kant goes into the critique of pure reason to attack Hume, because for Kant, he finds Reid's response totally unsatisfying, and that it's not detailed and rigorous enough to actually respond to the skepticism of David Hume. So Kant's not a huge fan of the common sense realist school, even though he was very aware of it during his time in many of his philosophical responses and treatises. So like Immanuel Kant, they argued the appeal to common sense fails to account for the subjective structures of cognition, right? Kant has the a priori categories, the 12 categories. He adds 2 on top of Aristotle's 10 categories and says these are the sort of synthetic apparatus in which reality is meshing onto our synthetic a priori categories. You see, Kant is finding this middle ground between skepticism of the external world, the innate ideas of Descartes, and an ability to actually come to knowledge claims. And so another is philosophical circularity. Some critics of Reid's reliance on common sense as circular, as it assumes the validity of human faculties without providing a deeper justification on why they're actually valid. And really, his argument is that that's the way we're made by God. And this is where, as an Orthodox, we'd say it's coming up a little bit short, Mr. Reid, because you're not appealing to revelation and the Christian tradition itself. You're appealing to God made us, and now through rational methods of observation and philosophical inquiry, I'm going to make the claim that Hume's skepticism is justified in the fact that we just have these natural beliefs. Well, if you're a skeptic, that's not very satisfying, because he's not actually providing a rational means for why they're real. He's just claiming God made us that way. And so it's a simplistic view of perception. So the direct realism of Scottish realism, epistemological monism, we are directly engaging with the external world, asserts that we perceive the world directly without intermediaries. Representationalism has been critiqued as oversimplifying the nature of perception. So the scientific challenges, developments in psychology and neuroscience suggest that perception involves complex cognitive processes, challenging the idea of a direct, unmediated relationship with the external world, right? So people would claim, well, when we observe the neofrontal cortex, we're clearly witnessing brain firings and neuron firings occurring. Is that not a mediation between our perception of the world? It's debated, but certainly that would be a scientific challenge to it. And a philosophical challenge, critics argue that Reid's dismissal of representationalism ignores the epistemological problem of how we can be sure our perceptions are accurately reflecting the external reality. And he really doesn't. He just says, look, it's impossible to make knowledge claims if it's not the case. And we all move through the world as if that's the case, because that's the way the Creator created us. And a failure to address skepticism, philosophers sympathetic to skepticism, including proponents of modern epistemology, argue that Reid's dismissal of skepticism as unreasonable does not fully engage with its arguments. Instead of offering a systematic refutation of skeptical concerns, Scottish realism often appeals to intuition or pragmatic necessity, which some see as philosophically inadequate. And this is certainly going to be the realm in which Greg Bonson, when we watch his video, he's coming from that school of thought for sure. And then over-reliance on first principles. Again, Reid reliance on first principles of common sense has been critiqued for lacking clear criteria to determine what qualifies as a first principle. It's arbitrary. Reid just comes up with his own. Again, laws of logic, mathematics, existence of nature. Oh my gosh. Existence of nature, material things, causal connections, memory, free will, moral principles. They're saying, well, how did you come to know that these were all first principles? He's saying, well, all these things are necessary for us to actually move and operate and come to knowledge in the world. And therefore, they are first principles by necessity. Hold on, I just smashed this bug and it smells like crap. I need to put hand sanitizer on. Okay, sorry about that. The thing almost went in my mouth. It was on my microphone. Did you guys see that? Yeah, did I just grab a fly? Yeah, a freaking flying bug was just right here on my microphone. It was right next to my mouth. I had no idea. Anyways, I just smashed it in my hand. It smells like crap. Ugh. Anyways, I digress. Sorry about that. See, common sense, natural beliefs. I perceived it, and it was actually there when I went to grab it. Um, um. Anyways, okay, moving on here. And then philosophical conservatism is a critique that it was overly conservative and overly simplistic. Okay. So why do philosophers mock Scottish realism? Intellectual simplicity. They claim that it failed to actually respond to skepticism, lacks a theoretical innovation, and has its own sort of perceived dogmas, like God created us and we have these first principles or natural beliefs or common sense to actually come to knowledge claims. And then it's overshadowed by later developments. German idealism, Kantian epistemology, and later analytic philosophy eclipsed Scottish realism. As I showed you guys earlier regarding my little graph here, and I have another one I wrote. Let's see this one. Here, this might be a little bit easier to read. This is on German idealism. So you see Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and then Kant's right there in the middle. And after Kant, philosophy splits into idealism and positivism. Okay. So, anywho, let's get back to where we were. Okay, moving through here. Reid versus Hume. So what is it that Reid is responding to Hume? We've already talked about skepticism about causality. So Hume famously argued that causality is not a feature of the external world, but a mental habit or custom. According to Hume, we cannot perceive a necessary connection between cause and effect. Instead, we infer it based on the repeated association of events. Again, mental habits. And that's what Hume characterizes as beliefs. And then he had a bundle theory of the self, which I already mentioned. Hume denied the existence of the persistent unified self. He argued that what we call the self is merely a collection or a bundle of impressions and ideas with no underlying substance. And then empiricism and representationalism. Hume, following the empiricist tradition of Locke and Berkeley, believed that we do not perceive objects directly, but instead perceive mental representations or ideas of external objects. And this led to a skepticism about the external world, as there is no direct evidence of objects outside of the mind. And then the radical skepticism about knowledge. By extending his empiricist principles, Hume arrived at a skeptical conclusion regarding the reliability of human faculties. He doubted whether reason, memory, or perception could ever lead to any sort of epistemological certainty. So, and then I want to read this table here, but I saw a super chat, so let's just kind of address these. CG throws in $5, says, woo, DPH. Thanks for responding to my fan mail. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you very much, CG. God bless you. And welcome, David James Flood became a COTEL crew member. God bless you, brother. Thank you so much for your support. And Siege D threw in a $2, said, did my Dono chat go through? First time using. Oh, let me check. I haven't checked Dono chat yet. Yes. Blue Skittle throws in $10 on Dono chat, says, evil Descartes be like, I do not think, therefore I do not am. That's pretty funny. Shout out to Blue Skittle. And Siege D threw in $4 and said, testing out this Dono chat thing. Let me know if you get it, DPH. Yes, I did get it, CG. Thank you so much, brother, for the support. And then while we're here, let's just check Streamlabs real quick. So, guys, smash that like. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope this is going to be educational and insightful for anybody who's wanting to learn more about Scottish realism. I know it's not the most popular topic. None of my philosophy streams are that popular, even though I think they're very interesting and useful. So I put this little table together here to help understand what exactly this empiricist school Reid is responding to. So we have John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume. And so origin of ideas, sensations and reflection, John Locke. Again, you're a tabula rasa. You're an empty slate. That impression, that experience itself is what forms our understandings. Now, I've seen Dan Robinson respond to some of these things by saying, look, a baby in its very infant state knows to suck its own thumb, demonstrating a sort of self-awareness and self-understanding that certainly doesn't seem to be shaped only by sense impression. Anyways, sensation of the mind. For George Berkeley, there are no material causes. Remember, he's saying the only thing that we have is the mind. That's the Berkeleyan school of thought. And then David Hume says all ideas derive from impressions, as we said. Nature of ideas, representations of external objects. Objects are ideas for Berkeley, and then ideas are faint copies of impressions for Hume. Material substance. John Locke says it exists and causes ideas. George Berkeley says it does not exist. Only the mind and ideas exist. And David Hume says it's unknowable. Material substance is meaningless. We can't ever know it anyways. Causation. John Locke saying real connections between objects that cause our mental representations. Berkeley saying God causes and sustains all events. Again, and all we have knowledge of is our mind. And David Hume says we perceive only constant conjunction, not necessary connection. Therefore, we can never prove or come to knowledge of causation itself. And the self, a thinking substance tied to memory for John Locke, a perceiving mind or spirit for Berkeley, and then for Hume, a bundle of perceptions with no unity or substance. And then abstract ideas, possible and necessary for Locke. Impossible, all ideas are particular for Berkeley. And then David Hume says impossible, ideas are specific and derived from impressions. Okay. So we pretty much got, again, in this document, somebody ask how they can get access to my document. This document, all the documents I create are available at my website for members, guys. If you go to my website and you go to the educational library, it's all the videos and all the documents I create are there. So if you would like to have access to this as your own overview of Scottish realism, and I've 10 other documents already on there on various topics, like a timeline over the Wild Wild West and all that stuff. Those are available for members, just $5 a month, and you can get access to all these documents and look at them for yourself. So we've already kind of hit at the Reid's response to David Hume. Now I want to move into his response to Descartes. So the Descartes' key ideas that Reid opposed, right? We've been talking about Hume, but he also was responding to Descartes. And so specifically the methodology. So the methodological doubt. Descartes famously began his philosophy with radical doubt, right? Systematically questioning all beliefs that could possibly be doubted, aiming to build knowledge on indubitable foundations. His conclusion encapsulated in the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, identified the self as the first certainty. And then he had the dualism of mind and body, which is still very much in favor. Cartesian dualism, as it's referred to. Descartes posited a sharp division between mind, a thinking, non-extended substance, and body, an extended, non-thinking substance. This dualism placed the mind as the foundation of all knowledge, with the external world and the body known only indirectly. And then representationalism. Descartes held that we do not perceive the external world directly, but through ideas. Now, he included innate ideas, ideas that are put in the mind by nature itself, by God, such as the belief in God. He believes is an innate idea. Every man has it. Mathematics is an innate idea. Logic is an innate idea. But our understanding of the external world is still representationalism. This raised the problem of how we can be certain that these representations correspond to reality. And then innate ideas. Descartes believed that certain ideas, such as the concept of God or mathematical truths, are innate and do not come from experience, but are instead embedded in the mind by its very nature. And so how did Reid go about critiquing Descartes? Well, the first was his opposition to his methodology. Reid rejected Descartes' method of universal doubt as an unrealistic and unnecessary starting point for philosophy. Common sense as a starting point, Reid argued that we do not doubt everything to arrive at truth. Instead, we can trust the natural beliefs that arise from common sense. For example, our belief in the existence of an external world and the reliability of perception and the continuity of self are foundational and need no proof. And in fact, you can't prove them rationally, according to Reid. Now, I want to play a quick thing. I didn't know if I was going to, but I think it's important here. Arthur Holmes discussing this stuff. Oh, wow, it's already... Okay, so this is Arthur Holmes. This is what I was trying to tell you guys. If you're interested in philosophy, and maybe you didn't go or take an intro to philosophy course in undergraduate, I highly, highly recommend the best way to attain a free education on philosophy, is to go through his lectures. You see down here, he's got 81 lectures, beginning with Greek philosophy, Hegel, phenomenology, philosophy of language, all types of stuff. And so I want to begin at, I think it's 3340 something here, where he's going to read Reid's response to Descartes. I already kind of mentioned this in the opening, but I think it's funny and it's insightful, so I want to play it for you guys real quick. And here's the link. If you guys have never watched Arthur Holmes, God rest his soul. He was a Christian philosopher, Protestant, but a good Christian philosopher. Here's the link right here.
What Reid says about your friend Descartes. A man like Descartes, who doubts his own existence, remember meditation 1, is surely as unfit to be reasoned with as a man who believes that he's made of glass. There may be disorders in the human frame that produce such extravagances, but they'll never be cured by reasoning.
So let me slow that down a bit too. I listen to everything at super fast speeds. That's 1 point. Arthur speaks kind of slow, so we'll do 1.25.
Now, in addition to the sort of ad hominem remarks, and in addition to the sense of humor, the obvious point is that if you think you don't exist, there's something that's not functioning right. You see? You've got some psychological problem. Your natural proclivities are misfiring. Because natural beliefs are spontaneous, they're not voluntary. They're spontaneous interpretations of experience. So that when you have a sensation, a physical sensation, it's a sign to you that there is some material object around. And so belief in the thing signified is a natural, spontaneous kind of reaction, response. Now you see what's happening there makes it sound like behavioristic stimulus response mechanisms. So that the nature of direct...
And in fact, aspects of Scottish realism, not, again, the Christian aspect or the total philosophy itself, but this understanding of the direct response of the external world to the biological entity itself is tied with Skinnerian behaviorism. And I think that's what Arthur's kind of hint at here.
Awareness is such that, if that's the I, okay, there's a stimulus, sensation, okay, which immediately produces response, affirm something's there. You didn't blink, you were supposed to. Because your blink would affirm the recognition of something there. I'll do it a little better next time. Now, while Reid, of course, is pre-behavioristic psychology, after the development of behavioristic psychology, Watson and so forth, yes, realists did start appealing to the stimulus reflex mechanisms and explaining the direct nature of sense awareness. So a sensation, then, is a sign that God has arranged we should get. A remembrance is a sign. You see, I'm remembering something. Something's coming back, I say, to my mind. Coming back? the sign that there is something there to come back. And spontaneously, I respond and affirm what I remember. And an imagination, what you know is simply imagination, is a sign, knowing it's something you're imagining, it's a sign that there is nothing there that you're believing. So that when I talk about my fairy giraffes with butterfly wings, you see, knowing that that's an imaginary kind of specimen, you don't take it as an indication of a material object. You take it as an indication of Holmes' crazy ideas. Nothing.
See, and he's highlighting that it's a mental sign as opposed to an imprinted idea through sensation impression. Because if you're talking about a unicorn, where does a unicorn exist? Where did the sense the material external world put sense impressions into my mind, David Hume, in which I created a unicorn? These are he's talking about how the imagination functions and creates signs as well, not these innate or not these representationalism of the external world, as some of the skeptics would say. So let's kind of move back, and we're going to go through more of my document. I promise you guys, when we get into the lectures, if you enjoy listening to like these very erudite, classically trained philosophers, I personally love listening to their rhetoric. I could listen to Arthur Holmes all day. I love the sound of his British voice and how animated he is about philosophy. So again, I highly recommend checking out Arthur Holmes if you're not familiar. Anyways, let's move through Reid's now response to Descartes. Critique of representationalism. I've kind of hammered that already. The epistemological troubles of representationalism. Reid pointed out that representationalism creates a gap between the mind and the world, which is true, making it difficult to explain how we can ever know that our representations correspond to reality. And that's his point, that Hume's skepticism is a dead end. If all we have is mental representations of an unknowable external world that's causing us sense impressions, how can we ever know that our representations are true? We can't. And this is why Reid says this is a philosophical dead end. Critique of dualism. Reid found Descartes' mind-body dualism problematic for several reasons. The integrated nature of human experience. Reid argued that human beings experience themselves as unified beings, not separate substances of mind and body. He saw Descartes' sharp division as artificial and inconsistent with the way we experience the world. And then obviously, as we talked about, Reid has a lot of trust in the mental faculties of the body itself. Our bodily senses and cognitive faculties are trustworthy and work seamlessly together to provide knowledge about the world. And again, as Orthodox, we would say, yeah, that's exactly how God created man and relationship to creation. Descartes' emphasis on the mind as separate from the body undermined this trust. And so, as I said, when we listen to Dan Robinson, he's a substance dualist, but he's going to steelman Reid and actually attack Hume through Reid, even though he himself is a substance dualist, coming more out of the Descartes or the Cartesian school. Rejection of innate ideas, as we said, perception as fundamental. He believes in a presentational perception, right? Presentation. These aren't representations. These are accurate presentations of the external world. Reid emphasized that perception, not innate ideas, is the primary source of our knowledge about the world. And then first principles, common sense, I've kind of hammered that home. And so Reid's philosophical project as a response to Descartes. Again, we kind of hit all these things: unity of mind and body, rejection of abstract rationalism. Reid criticized Descartes' reliance on abstract reasoning detached from experience. Again, he's saying somebody who denies their own existence based on abstract reasoning is somebody who has a psychological problem, because clearly you can't deny your own physical existence. He emphasized the importance of empirical observation and the role of practical judgment in philosophy. Philosophy should not alienate itself from common human concerns or the empirical realities of the world. Reid viewed excessive abstraction as leading to errors and unnecessary confusion. So Reid is creating a philosophy that is true both for the philosopher and the farmer, right? And so, yeah, we kind of covered that. Now, the last point that I want to show you guys is orthodoxy versus Scottish realism. And I couldn't find anything online directly referring to this conversation. So I think this might be the first a comparison, at least that I found. There's probably something out there. I mean, my gosh, we live on a world with 8 billion people. Maybe somebody else has done this, but I think this is one of the first comparisons between the Orthodox Christian paradigm and Scottish realism. And so I wrote, Scottish realism and Orthodoxy share some overlapping principles, as we said, particularly those inspired by a biblical worldview, but they diverge significantly in their epistemological foundations, metaphysical outlook, and theological commitments. Below is a detailed analysis. So the first ones I have is the affirmation of objective truth. These are points of agreement. Where does Scottish realism and Orthodoxy agree? Objective truth. Truth is grounded for the realism. Scottish realism, grounded in the reality of the external world, which can be known directly through human faculties such as perception, reason, and memory. Truth is universal and accessible to all through common sense. Orthodoxy, truth is understood as the person of Jesus Christ, the Logos of God. Objective truth exists, is eternal, and is revealed through divine revelation, particularly in scriptures and the church and the incarnation. So both affirm the existence of objective truth and reject relativism. Trust in human cognitive faculties. Both believe that, in a sense, we're made in the image of God, and God endowed us with certain abilities and cognitive faculties. And so both affirm that human faculties are fundamentally trustworthy. We're not skeptics, although Eastern Orthodoxy situates this trust within a theological framework. And I wrote here, human faculties are created by God and are intrinsically good, reflecting that imago Dei. Despite the fall, these faculties are still capable of functioning correctly, particularly when guided by divine grace. This gets back to the role of theosis, which I'm going to highlight here as a difference in cleansing our noetic faculties so that we actually have, we can use our cognitive faculties correctly. Emphasis on common experience. Both Scottish realism says philosophical inquiry begins with common sense beliefs shared by all rational beings, such as a belief in the external world and causality. Orthodoxy says our theology often appeals to the shared spiritual experiences of the faithful, particularly in the context of liturgy, prayer, and ascetic practices as source of truth and understanding. Both value shared human experiences as a foundation for understanding reality itself, albeit in very different ways. And then rejection of radical skepticism. Both of them reject radical skepticism. Scottish realism rejects skepticism as impractical and self-defeating, affirming that natural trustworthiness of human faculties and common sense. And we reject skepticism about God's existence, the reliability of divine revelation, and the efficacy of human participation in divine grace. Orthodoxy emphasizes faith as a form of spiritual knowledge. Now, the points of disagreement, and these are really interesting. Gosh, dang it, another fly in here. So epistemology and nature and source of knowledge. Scottish realism. These are where we differ with Scottish realism and where we would agree with some of the criticisms that are aimed at that particular project. Scottish realism claims that knowledge is primarily empirical and rational, derived from human perception and reason. Truths about the world are self-evident and accessible to all rational beings through common sense. We claim that knowledge is hierarchical. The highest knowledge comes through divine revelation and participation in God's uncreated energies, not merely through natural reason. This is why Orthodoxy, we do not base our worldview on natural theology or natural philosophy. Spiritual truths are not always accessible through reason or empirical observation, but are revealed by God and experienced through the ascetic and sacramental life. So the key difference is Scottish realism emphasizes the sufficiency of natural faculties, where Orthodoxy insists on the necessity of divine revelation and grace for ultimate knowledge. Our metaphysics, nature of reality. Scottish realism focuses on the natural material world and assumes a clear distinction between the human mind and the external world, which can be known directly. Relies on common sense to affirm the existence of objects as they appear. Eastern Orthodoxy views reality as permeated by the divine presence. The material world is not merely, quote, natural, but sacramental, pointing beyond itself back to God the Creator. Orthodox metaphysics emphasizes the interplay between the created and the uncreated, particularly through the doctrine of divine energies and theosis, human participation in the life of God. So the difference, Orthodoxy has a deeply spiritual and sacramental view of reality, while Scottish realism has a primarily empirical and material focus. Or anthropology, the nature of the human person. Scottish realism views humans as rational agents with reliable cognitive faculties capable of knowing the world through common sense. The self is understood as a unified, persisting entity based on experience and reason. Now, as we go through these differences, notice how we don't actually totally disagree with the Scottish realist. It's that our worldview, what the Scottish realist is claiming, is like a subsection of a larger understanding of our paradigm. So what they said there isn't false. It's just that their beginning point is like 4 or 5 steps back from our beginning point. So Eastern Orthodoxy views humans as created in the Imago Dei, as a spiritual dimension that is deeply affected by the fall. The human person is understood as body, soul, and nous, capable of union with God through theosis. Orthodox anthropology emphasizes spiritual transformation and the healing of the noetic faculties, the spiritual intellect, through grace. Orthodoxy sees human nature as fundamentally oriented towards communion with God, while Scottish realism has a more naturalistic and rationalistic view of humanity. The role of God in knowledge. While many Scottish realists were theists, their philosophy does not require explicitly on reliance of God for epistemology or metaphysics. Knowledge is grounded in natural faculties and common sense. And like I said, these common realists, the vast majority were Presbyterian. So they were faithful, God-fearing Protestant Christians. But this is why their movement later on, somebody like G.E. Moore, who no longer uses their theistic justification, can still use aspects of their philosophical project because it's not dependent upon God himself. Meanwhile, in Orthodoxy, God is central to all knowledge. Without divine illumination, humans cannot fully comprehend spiritual or even natural truths. God's uncreated energies sustain all creation and make knowledge possible. Scottish realism operates largely within a naturalistic framework, whereas Orthodoxy integrates all knowledge within a theological and theocentric framework. Ethics and morality. For them, morality is grounded in natural law and human reason, which provide a common sense foundation for ethical behavior. And meanwhile, for us, morality is inseparable from communion with God. Ethical behavior is not merely about rational adherence to principles, but about spiritual transformation and alignment with God's will through ascetic struggle in the sacramental life. Key difference: Orthodoxy's ethical framework is theocentric and transformative, while Scottish realism's is anthropocentric and pragmatic. And then the last point of difference that I had was the relationship between faith and reason, which I think is really interesting. Faith and reason are compatible, but operate in largely separate domains for the Scottish realists. Philosophy begins with natural faculties, and religious belief is a matter of personal conviction or supplementary to philosophy, where in Orthodoxy, faith, in fact, is a form of knowledge that transcends reason. It goes beyond reason, but does not contradict reason. Reason serves faith, but is insufficient for comprehending the mysteries of God. Again, that's why our church is the mystical church. And so, yes, great point. John of Damascus lover says, faith is a necessary precondition for reasoning itself. And this is where even I've seen Jim Bob in debates with atheists highlight the things that they have faith in that they cannot empirically justify. So we all have faith. The point is, what are you putting your faith in? Orthodoxy is saying you must put your faith in the Holy Trinity for a correct utilization of reason. If not, reason will go off the rails and it could lead you in places that actually are irrational, self-contradictory. That's what Reid is trying to claim against Hume. And so Scottish realism gives primacy to reason and epistemology, while Orthodoxy subordinates reason to faith and divine revelation. So our structure of epistemology begins with revelation, faith, and then reason. That's how we understand it as Orthodox. And so the two main contentions here are epistemology and metaphysics, as we already highlighted. So those are going to be, that's kind of my overview. Again, that whole document, if you guys are interested, will be available on my website after the stream is over. It's not at the moment, but it will be. And now what I want to do is show you guys some videos. I want to work through this whole lecture of Dan Robinson. Some of you guys may have watched this stuff before. I'm recently familiar with him, but as I said, I just bought his his book. This is his wiki right here, Daniel Robinson. Very, very sharp guy. I actually really enjoyed listening to him, even though he's Catholic, but he does a great job of like criticizing various philosophers and philosophical projects from, you know, he is himself Christian, but he doesn't just use it. He plays the philosophical game, if you will. And he has a book called An Intellectual History of Psychology, which has been praised and is often considered a sort of tome in the work. So I recently just purchased this today. Maybe you guys would be interested in that if you enjoy the subject. I love intellectual history. And that's really what we're doing today is you learn philosophical systems, but I love the history of ideas. I love how people and philosophical projects are responding to other projects and what it's all about. I love reading about intellectual history. It's one of my favorite things to read about. And so I'm excited to get that. And maybe I'll do a stream on it in the future at some point. But I want to play this whole 52-minute and 20-second lecture by him. And he has, and this was a course that he gave at Oxford, and it's just purely on Reid's critiques of Hume. Reid's critiques of Hume. So he is Steelmanning a school of philosophy, Scottish realism, that's really fallen out of favor, and arguing against Hume, who is still, like I said, you can make an argument that Hume's the most important English writing philosopher. And so he's used, why does it keep doing that? He's using Reid to respond to Hume in a 8-part lecture series. So you might want to check that out. This is on Philosophy Overdose. Here, I'll share that link with you guys. If you guys want to watch all these things later, feel free. Rogue Runa throws in $2 and says, W philosophy stream, super helpful as a college student. Well, thank you very much, Rogue Runa. I hope it is useful and you gain something from it. And thank you so much, Dano, for the $5 super chat. No comment. God bless you, brother. And major thank you to Justin Henley for gifting a COTEL Crew membership. Really appreciate your support, Justin. God bless you. And while we're here, let me just check the Dono chat. Nope, nothing on Dono chat. Again, if you have any questions or comments, or you guys want to support my work, it actually takes quite a bit of time to dive in and actually get all the information together for some of these philosophy streams. I enjoy doing them, but I know they're never that popular, and they take a lot of effort to put everything together. At least for me, it does. Maybe people who are more gifted. I like to really get into the weeds of some of these various schools. So if you enjoy it, if you like it, please support my work. I'd greatly appreciate that. Okay. So, do you guys want to listen to any more Arthur Holmes? I mean, he has a good overview here. I feel like we pretty much hammered anything that he's going to present. And what I want to do now is play this 14-minute clip from Greg Bonson, where he is basically critiquing common sense realism. So he's coming from a point in which, remember, he's sort of one of the fathers of the transcendental argument for God, but he is very critical of Scottish common sense realism. So I want to play him, and I have it at 1.25. So let me put it down at normal, just so everybody's okay with it, doesn't complain. So here's Greg Bonson on his critiques of common sense realism.
Enlightenment movement that we should consider in your outline. B, Thomas Reid and Scottish common sense realism. Common sense realism, the Scottish school, was influential not only in Scotland among Presbyterians in particular, but all the more in American Presbyterianism. When one thinks here of the example of John Witherspoon, who had a part in the early founding of our country, Declaration of Independence and so forth. Scottish common sense realism. The first realist that we'll look at is Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796. He was a Scot and an influential opponent of David Hume, who was also a Scot. Okay, so you have Scottish Hume being now opposed by Scottish Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid was a Presbyterian minister. He became regent in the University of Aberdeen in 1751 and then a professor at Glasgow in 1764. Reid promoted an empirical epistemology without John Locke's intervening representational ideas. And that's the easiest way to summarize the epistemology of the common sense realist. He has an empirical epistemology, an empirical theory of knowledge, but without John Locke's intervening representational ideas. Can we go back to Locke for a minute? Remember, Locke says the human mind doesn't know the world out there. It knows ideas of the world out there, and these ideas are supposed to represent or image, reflect their objects. So there's an object, an apple, which creates an idea in my mind. And what I know is the idea in my mind. So there's a intervening representational idea between me and the object. Y'all remember that? Shake your heads if you're awake. Good. And what Thomas Reid does is he rejects this intervening idea. He says sense impressions are not copies of the world, but sense impressions make immediate contact with real objects. Sense impressions make immediate contact with real objects. Consequently, for Thomas Reid, reality is what it appears to the senses. He doesn't have the problem now of the other empiricists that we only know appearances of the world. He says we know the world directly. We're in contact with the objects of the world directly. So reality is what it appears to the senses. And not only that, the objects of sensation exist independent of our experience of them. That is, by the way, technically what realism means in the modern phase of philosophy. Realism in medieval philosophy meant that universals exist independently. But realism in the days of the Enlightenment comes to be the view that the objects of perception exist independently of the mind.
So you see that move, again, if we get back to my little graph between what becomes idealism and the positivist schools, is that before we had dogmatic metaphysics, traditional metaphysics. Now, as that falls out of favor, post a la Descartes, now the emphasis on universals is human perception itself, which will be continued after Kant through German idealism and phenomenology, because what they're interested in is just the study of our mental perception of the world, because we can't fully know the external world. They've given up on the project of the knowability of the external world, and therefore, if we're going to come to universal truth claims, we're going to come to universal truth claims through the observation and the study of phenomenon in the mind, phenomenology. And that's what characterizes the continental school. This is the European school of philosophy. That's why it's called continental. It's on the European continent. Meanwhile, the empirical and positive school and things like 19th century British empiricism, this is what's going to characterize the Anglosphere. So when you're talking about England, Australia, and certainly America, we're philosophically dominated by the analytical school of philosophy, not the phenomenological continental school of philosophy, making that distinction.
And so the school is known as common sense realism. Common sense, meaning the way the world appears is the way the world is. Realism, because the objects that appear to me exist independently of their appearing to me. So who is he standing over against when he says the objects exist independently of their appearance to me, independently of my perception of them? I'm sorry? Over against Berkeley. Exactly right. So there's a real world of objects out there, and I know them directly, not via ideas that represent them or reflect them. Well, how do we know that the world is as it appears to us? How can we be sure of this? And the answer of Thomas Reid is we know this intuitively, that is, we know it directly, or better, he put it this way, we know it by common sense.
Or also natural beliefs. He uses these natural beliefs, these first principles, as another way to refer to common sense. So I don't want you to think common sense is just like, well, obviously it's obvious. In a sense, it is, yes. But he believes these are natural beliefs imbued to us by the Creator himself.
Common sense. These convictions of ours about a world of objects that are as they appear to us is justified by universal consent. Universal consent.
And you're about to hear Bonson blow up on him because he's saying this is not sufficient philosophy to appeal to, you know, universal consent on the fact that the external world seems to be knowable based on our perception of it being accurate. So even though we would agree with that as Christians, he's saying philosophically, this is totally inadequate. You're about to hear him start railing against it.
That's what common sense means. It's the sense, the intuition, the direct apprehension that all men have in common. Common sense, intuition. It's justified by universal consent. Why should there be such universal consent about there being a world of real objects that we know directly, not just the appearances of them? He said it is rooted in the constitution of our nature. That's why it's universal. All men have it constituently in their nature to consent to the idea of there being a world of objects that we know and not just the appearances of them. Yes. Well, I think it'd be a very worthwhile term paper or project or even doctoral dissertation, and his philosophy, how he would have approached Romans 1. I can tell you, I was going to say this in a moment, but I'll tell you now, that this school of thought is universally disdained among philosophers. And though he's a Presbyterian minister and this way of thinking was influential in the founding of my country and all that, as a philosopher, I have to tell you, this is not good philosophy. You know, here we have all these complicated problems that have risen, you know, through continental rationalism and British empiricism and so forth. And though they didn't make a direct move to this conclusion in this way, but it comes down to this. Well, we really do know the world and there are objects. And how do we know that we know? By common sense. Everybody agrees that we know this world and so forth. But that's not much of an argument when you think about it. Common sense. Let me show you. It's one of the problems with common sense is.
And that's one of the ironies of it is it does kind of fall flat in regards to a sort of philosophical criteria for the defense of these natural beliefs, this common sense first principles. But if he appealed, like, again, what I was highlighting with the distinctions between common sense realism and orthodoxy is orthodoxy is explicit about divine revelation, faith, and then reason. So from our worldview, we can agree with much of the Scottish realist school, except when they're trying to play the philosophical game of reason within the Enlightenment project, it really doesn't deal with it because and this is why they're claimed it's circular, because they just say, well, we know the external world because everybody agrees on it because that's the way we're made. And yes, it is, but you know, unfortunately, that's not going to really stand up in regards to philosophical scrutiny.
The world is as it appears to our senses, right? Well, I'm now holding up a quarter in front of you, and I'm holding it, as we say, flat to the audience. What do your senses tell you about the configuration of that quarter? Or you're going to say, well, it's round. Okay. Now, I think you all believe, by common sense, you haven't seen me do any magic tricks with my hands here. I've got the same quarter in my hand. Now, how does it look to you? I'm not holding it flat to the audience. And now, don't make corrections from what you expect. If you're actually being perceptual, you'll tell me the quarter looks what? Oval. Right. So which is it? Shall we say, is it rational to say that oval and circle are identical? No. But perceptually, I've got one object that has both configurations. Now, which is it? I'm just trying to show you how naive common sense realism is as a philosophy. I don't disagree that there is a world of objects. I don't disagree that the way the world appears to us is basically what reality is. I just don't think you can get to it directly by appealing to the common conviction of mankind that is rooted in their nature. By the way, if it does work to say that that common conviction is rooted in the nature of man, then from a philosophical standpoint, we have to ask, how do we know what the nature of man is?
Which would get back to revelation. You see, it gets back to the appeal to revelation over reason, because reason, if you just use reason, it comes to these dead ends where it's unprovable. And you get to, I mean, Humean skepticism is really that's where you arrive if you're consistent with all your presuppositions. And to defend Reid to the quarter that Bonson was talking about, holding it up flat, it's round, and then holding it up and demonstrating its flat edge and demonstrating that that's sort of an optical illusion, as Reid would probably say, that's an exception. That's not, that's the exception to the rule. That's not the rule itself. And that if somebody were to go then analyze and look at the quarter that Bonson was holding, they would come to the conclusion, oh, this is a quarter. It has it's thin, has a round edge, and it's circular. So Reid would say, yeah, but upon further investigation of the quarter, we would still come to true and accurate beliefs of observing the external object itself. But Bonson is highlighting a sort of rational, theoretical, hypothetical that many people have levied at common sense realism.
So it's not just common sense, ultimately, is it? On this basis, on this approach, the only basis you could have is to say God has revealed to us what the common nature of man is.
Which they don't do, but would at least, then they would have stronger standing ground as a philosophical project if they did do that.
Okay, as it goes, I'm not against appealing to revelation. But obviously, in appealing to revelation, you're not appealing to common sense anymore, are you? And moreover, if you're going to appeal to revelation to tell you what the constitution of human nature is, in which is grounded this universal consent, then why don't you just appeal to revelation to prove that there's a world of real objects that we know with our senses?
Which would be the orthodox criticism of common sense realism, as we've already articulated multiple times. Beginning with common sense and saying the common sense natural beliefs are given to us by God, you started in the wrong place. You need to begin with divine revelation as the way in which we understand human constitution. He doesn't.
Why go the long way around the barn? You're going to go to Revelation and do the whole thing. Anyway, so I hope you can see, even if you have sympathies for their conclusions and for their religious convictions, the Scottish common sense realists were fairly naive in terms of their approach to philosophy. Reid wrote a book in 1764 entitled Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. And in it he said, the sensations that we have are natural signs, not arbitrary or mere verbal signs in our mind, but they are natural signs of their objects. And you'll like this, even though, again, it's just an assertion, not a proof. He said these natural signs in our minds are much more powerful than any theory. Theories are enchantment with words, he called them. And so you get somebody like David Hume coming along, and he may theoretically argue against these natural signs and so forth. But according to Reid, the natural signs are more powerful than any enchantment with words. Well, again, we're sympathetic to this because we don't like the skepticism of Hume. But is that an answer to the skeptic? You tell the skeptic, I have these natural signs. I have sensations, perceptions of the world out there, and they are so convincing to me that I don't care what your philosophy says, your enchantment with words, your theories. I'm more convicted about my perceptions than about your philosophy. Yeah, but that's not an answer. Would David Hume agree that you're more convicted by your perceptions than by any philosophical theory? Yeah, remember, we just saw, he says that's true too. He goes, my theory doesn't allow for absolute certainty. I have to be skeptical about everything, but I can't live that way. Instinctively, I've got to act as though there's causation, enduring objects, and so forth. And so, in one sense, Reid is not answering Hume.
And Hume, this is where Hume and Reid agree on these sort of beliefs. Now, Reid is saying these are natural beliefs that are constituted in the nature of man. And Hume's saying, well, we just have natural beliefs, but it doesn't mean they're true. It means that's the way in which we can function and live our lives and come to some sort of resolution and conclusion. But they're just beliefs. They're not proven. They're not factual. And so that, again, Bonson's highlighting, is Reid accurately responding to Hume? Not really, because Hume would agree. He would just say, you're not answering my question.
He's joining forces with Hume because I've got this instinct that forces me to believe this way. Okay, let's move on. A second Scottish common sense.
Okay, so that was him being done with Thomas Reid. Now, I want to, and I'm so glad I found this presentation by Dan Robinson, because what he's going to do is he's going to Steelman Reid. Now, again, this is a Catholic philosopher, and I think that you guys will find him very interesting, like I did. But unlike Bonson, who's saying, look, Reid is not actually addressing Hume, Robinson is going to say, no, he is, and here's why. Now, we are both all going to agree that beginning with common sense and these natural beliefs as opposed to revelation is the shortcoming of Scottish realism. They're not beginning in the right point. But I want you to hear a philosopher who's actually going to Steelman Reid, because it's so much more common to sort of highlight the shortcomings of Scottish realism. As Bonson said, it's totally fallen out of favor within philosophical departments. You're not going to find anybody who calls themselves a Scottish common sense realist anymore, even though that pragmatic understanding of human constitution was essential for, the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the founding of America. It's all really a project coming out of Scottish realism. I mean, you can make an argument that Scottish realism was one of, if not the most influential school of thought to the founding fathers. But anyways, here is Dan Robinson.
Well, who was Thomas Reid? That's a question that about 10 years ago was almost a quiz question. I think the first time...
And sorry about the static of the audio. It gets a little bit better after a few more minutes. So if that's bothering anybody, I apologize. This is the presentation. This is the lecture. And this is unfortunately true for a few of Robinson's, because I found this one. I listened to this one as well in preparation. This is on the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment and Scottish realism on the founding of America, which is really fascinating. But in that video, there's a Q&A with Dan Robinson, and that's where I'm jealous of the ability of him to just, somebody can ask, well, what does Edmund Burke say about this or that? And he has just such incredible recall of, which work it's in. If I'm, it was written in this book in this year in this city, and what he's responding to is this right here. So anyways, deal with the static. After a couple minutes, it's going to go away. It's not going to be as bad.
Time I had occasion to publish anything on Reid was 1978, when the journal The Monist hosted essays on Reid. And at the time, I think it's fair to say he was very largely a forgotten figure. Late in the 18th century, he was a quite celebrated figure. In fact, I can give you a sense of that. There's a lengthy history of correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams on a whole range of issues. This is after the two of them had ceased being presidents of the United States, etc. Their friendship was patched up again. And there's one letter that finds Adams asking Jefferson, were you ever acquainted with Dougal Stewart? And Dougal Stewart was Thomas Reid's closest friend, probably, his former student. And in fact, Jefferson knew Dougal Stewart very well. And so Jefferson writes back and he says, yes, I knew Stewart very well. I regard him as one of the two greatest metaphysicians of the age. The other one Jefferson has in mind is Destutt Leconte de Tracy. Adams goes on to say, well, I've just read his Philosophy of the Human Mind, and I believe that in this work, in perspicuity, etc., he exceeds Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, wait, and even Dr. Reid. Now, just a way of saying that Adams did not have to say much more than that, because Reid was held in such high regard. One more bit of Americana, because I'm trying to have you appreciate the distance over which Reid's influence ranged. He had a profound influence on secondary education in France, which came to be organized around Scottish common sense precepts. In the first major jurisdictional dispute ever settled by a U.S. Supreme Court, this was a 1793 case referred to as Chisholm versus Georgia. It had to do with whether or not a citizen could sue a state in a federal court. That's what the issue was. The opinion in that case was given by Justice James Wilson, a native Scot. And how does he begin the opinion? He says, well, before we get into the details of the case, if you would want to know the foundational principles upon which judgment itself depends, you can do no better than to consult the estimable work of Dr. Reid, which he titles An Inquiry into the Human Mind. Now, those of you who haven't kept up with U.S. Supreme Courts over the course of decades and centuries, I should tell you that it would be very rare today that the Supreme Court would be citing Reid's inquiry. It's rather more likely they'd be citing Newsweek or something. But there was Reid's influence. He was for many years on the faculty at Aberdeen, and then he succeeded Adam Smith in the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow. His first major work, he had published a couple of things before this, but the first major work was The Inquiry, which appeared in 1764 when Reid was 54, meaning by this time he would have been denied tenure at least every major institution in the world, because he hadn't published very much till this came out. He wanted to have the work read by Hume, because it is quite a critical appraisal, not only of Hume's philosophy, but of what we refer to as British empiricism itself. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and before them, Descartes, and before them, most of the ancients and medievalists, all of whom, or very nearly all of whom on Reid's account, subscribe to, whatever their differences philosophically might be, they subscribe to this very odd position, according to which we do not have direct knowledge of objects in the external world, but only some kind of mediated awareness transmitted by the sense organs, with absolutely no way of determining how validly or accurately or coherently the sense organs do capture what is in the external world. And Reid says if that theory is correct, which he will come to dub the ideal theory referring to the proposition that all we know directly are our own ideas, and we can't get far enough out of the box to know accurately whatever it is that's bringing about those ideas. Reid says if that theory is correct, quote, I lay my hands across my lips and become a skeptic. Because if in fact you're in no position, you have absolutely no epistemic resources available with which to distinguish between what your senses are reporting and what in the external world are exciting the sensory reports, then for all you know, there isn't anything in the external world. In fact, to be quite consistent in the application of the ideal theory is finally to take the position that George Berkeley took, and that is simply to dismiss the proposition that there is a mind-independent, really existing external material world. Now that's skepticism of a certain kind. So this is going to be what Reid is addressing. And as I say, he wanted Hume at least to get a look at the manuscript. He didn't know Hume. They traveled in different circles. Hume, by the way, traveled in quite fashionable circles for all of his, shall we say, his rather unorthodox religious views, i.e. he had none, actually. He was still consulted on major university appointments, though he was never able to get one himself, and that chiefly on the grounds of his lack of orthodoxy within a Scottish community that was serious about its Presbyterianism. But
it's funny, I heard one story about Hume. He would travel to France, where, again, atheism was much more common than in Scotland. That's what made Hume sort of gain the animosity of many of the Scottish realists, is that he was an explicit atheist and he was a radical skeptic. But he was, in a sense, found a lot of celebration in France, and he would go to various salons in France, around Paris, and the women would sit, and some of the men would sit and listen to Hume pontificate as if he was this wise oracle exuding about his skepticism and his atheism. And I just found that very interesting to note that within his own country of Scotland, Hume wasn't exactly celebrated, even though his critiques and his philosophical acumen was certainly recognized, but he wasn't celebrated like he was in other places, like in France.
Hume traveled in rather fashionable circles. Those of you familiar with Scottish religious history knows that by the middle of the 18th century, there was something, a divide within the Presbyterian communion, where a so-called moderate wing and a more modern wing, part of them were quite at home with favors from court, with trafficking in aristocratic and highly cultivated circles, whereas the rest were country parsons who thought that the proper business of a parson was to go into a community and serve its needs, quite skeptical about any close association with government, with princes, with kings, etc.
And this is one of the things that differentiated the Scottish Enlightenment from other Enlightenment movements in Europe, is that Scotland didn't have the same aristocratic strata of society as, say, somebody like France did. And so you can then, from that perspective, you can understand the Scottish realism having a sort of pragmatic dimension, because it's coming from the context of a culture that doesn't have the same aristocratic flavor of the elite, the social elite, as some of these other places.
That branch of Presbyterianism, by the way, found itself quite at home in the United States and was very instrumental in establishing strong barriers between church and state. That's another chapter in intellectual and cultural history. So it's not surprising that Reid and Hume would not be rubbing shoulders. But they did have a friend in common, and that was Hugh Blair. And so Reid asked Blair if he could have Hume read the inquiry. Hume scanned it. I can't believe he read it closely. At one point he says, "It strikes me that it's a throwback to innate ideas." If Hume had a very discerning mind, there's no way you'd read the inquiry and see it as a throwback to any kind of Cartesian innate idea or Platonic innate idea. But that's when he concludes his letter back to Blair saying, look, my view is that clergymen should spend their time bothering each other and should leave philosophy to philosophers. So that was the first pass. And Blair wanted Hume to give it a much closer reading, which Hume did do, and then wrote back to Reid, as I pointed out a week ago, in a quite complimentary vein, and the correspondence at that point ceased. In the last year of his life, when Hume sent off the final emendations for the publication of the last set of his essays that would be edited by his own hand, he informed his publisher that with these emendations, he thought he had addressed all of the objections raised by Dr. Reid. So this is years later. The inquiry came out in 1764. Hume is writing this in 1776, and he is still thinking in terms of whether or not he has addressed Reid's criticisms responsibly. Now, how are we to understand the nature of Reid's critique? Well, first, it's methodological. He is satisfied that philosophers who have come to defend what he calls the ideal theory have never adduced an iota of proof in its behalf. They have introspected on whatever it is taking place as far as they can tell in their own minds, and each of them individually has then advanced a theory that is supposed to capture the operation of the human mind in all of the affairs of life, wherever mental life is found, in whatever culture, presumably any age group, under any condition of health or disease short of madness. And this is a very grandiose way of proceeding. And on Reid's account, Reid being a strict Newtonian and Baconian, this is simply not the way science is done. This is what has always given philosophy a bad name. People sitting around, spinning off conjectures and theories with absolutely no access to methods by which to determine in a systematic and scientific way whether the theory is grounded or groundless. So part of the critique is methodological. You see that very early in chapter 6. The focus of your reading should be on chapter 6 of the inquiry, the chapter on seeing. He says, if we pay proper attention to how our mind operates in our use of this faculty, we shall become aware that the visible appearance of objects is something we hardly ever notice. That is, if you were setting out to test the ideal theory, remember the ideal theory is stipulating that the impressions formed by an external stimulus constitute that level of appearance at which you are aware of things. Nobody pays attention to this. I shall get to this a little later in lecture. For example, would you look up here right now? You see this, don't you? But the minute I do this, the pattern of visual stimulation is profoundly altered. And if I do this, it is incredibly altered. And in fact, with every breath I take and every breath you take, the distance between us changes. And the projection on the retina changes. There will be changes due to cloudy days, changes due to time of day, changes due to whether we've just eaten or haven't eaten yet, and on. Changes when we first get up in the morning, changes very late at night. How is it that we have a stability, a recurrence, a repeatability, a constant identification of stimuli as what they are, notwithstanding these profound changes at the level of appearances, so to speak, or sensory impressions, of which we take no note at all? So that's going to be something that recurs within the chapter of seeing. So as Reid says, wise men now agree, or ought to, that there's only one route to knowledge of nature's works, namely the path of observation and experiment. We have built into us a strong propensity for bringing particular facts and observations under general rules and applying such general rules to explain other effects or to show how to produce them. He goes on to say that the method is very much like the method used by ordinary people when they're attempting to satisfy certain objectives and goals. Quote, "This intellectual process is familiar to every human creature in the common affairs of life, and it is the only one by which any real discoveries in philosophy can be made. Conjectures and theories are created by men and will always be found to be very unlike the things created by God or by nature." Reid interchangeably uses God, the author of our being, the mint of nature, etc. It's quite clear what he's getting at. He labors under what Professor Dawkins would call the God delusion, I guess. Now, Reid's own background gives him an authoritative position with just how it is science proceeds. On his mother's side, he was a Gregory. Gregory was one of the successors to the Lucasian professorship of mathematics at Cambridge. Reid was an expert in optics. He was original in his thinking in mathematics. And he was tied in with a Scottish educational scheme that only fairly recently had abandoned what was called the regenting system. I don't know if that's a term familiar to you, the regenting system. Under the regenting system, when students arrived at university, they would be assigned a tutor, a regent, who for their entire undergraduate years, their preparatory years, would teach them every subject. So the regent would teach, yes, Latin and Greek, and mathematics and astronomy, and rhetoric and philosophy, etc. Now they gave it up. Sooner or later, I guess you think you have to. Why? Well, advances in all of these fields having been considerable, particularly from the 17th century on, the thought was that nobody could have the kind of commanding knowledge necessary to teach all those subjects over a course of years. But Reid himself was part of that cadre, prepared to do that, and his grounding in the sciences was expert, highly developed, and known to be. We've now seen published a fair amount of his previously unpublished papers. The first huge collection of unpublished papers by Reid were held at Aberdeen on microfilm as part of what was called the Birkwood collection. And when it came out, I had an opportunity to go through every page of it. It is quite remarkable, particularly the fraction of the Birkwood papers devoted to physics, optics, and mathematics and astronomy. General solutions to the problem of the aberration, highly sophisticated solutions to astronomical problems of consequence. So
we got a super chat that just came in. Let me catch up on some of those. So I think we hit Ed, threw in $5, no comment. Amateum throws in $2, says, is there a correlation between Scottish common sense realism and sola scriptura? And I would say yes, in some sense. Now, it's not explicit. Thomas Reid's never making the explicit claim of sola scriptura, but you can see a presupposition in the sense that he's focusing purely on nature as sort of the scriptural apparatus created by God, if you will, to come to ultimate universal conclusions about knowledge, the external reality, moral principles, these types of things, and doing it so through a rational means. Now, it's debated. I certainly don't think Luther in his Reformation was intending to create a new religion per se. But you can argue that Protestantism, as it took off, became a highly rational ideology. Now, as we talked about in the last stream with Joel Webbin, contemporary Protestantism is actually, in many ways, different than even the Protestantism of Calvin or Luther or something like that. But I would say you can certainly see a connection in the sense that the natural world itself is a divinely created creation that we can observe and perform experiment and rational inquiry and come to ultimate universal conclusions. And so in that sense, just like we were talking about, the Scottish realism isn't appealing to divine revelation, faith, and then reason. It's appealing to reason and its relationship to the natural world and coming to ultimate conclusions. So if you're going to use from that, I guess you could say there's a sort of superficial connection between some of the presuppositions of sola scriptura and and Scottish common sense realism, but it's not explicit or anything. Thomas Reid's not making the claim that you have to be, a Presbyterian for these things to be true. But I would say, at least in regards to his method, there's a similarity there at the least.
So Reid is not simply tooting a horn. He's not wagging a finger. He has a scientific cast of mind shaped by a close and long study of the sciences, and is persuaded that the methods advocated by Bacon and by Newton are simply not followed by philosophers who nonetheless make all sorts of claims about our knowledge of the external world and the nature of the external world without ever getting out of an armchair. And when they get out of an armchair, what is it they discover? Well, Reid says they discover what Hume discovers when he got out of his armchair. The first thing we learn in the treatise, when Hume is finished discussing causation, which I shall take up later in this term, is that, of course, when he goes out into the world, he thinks the way everyone else does. But it's only in the privacy of his study that he realizes that there are these conundrums associated with the concept of causation. What does Reid say about that? He says, we see then that Mr. Hume's philosophy is very much like a hobby horse, which a man, when he is ill, can keep at home with him and ride to his contentment. But just in case he should bring it into the exchange, bring it into the marketplace, his friends would quickly impanel a jury and confiscate his estates and have the solicitude never to leave him alone. The point being that a skeptical position, something as fundamental as causation, puts you at peril. And now the question is whether the dictates of common sense, which are serviceable throughout the animal economy, are to be abandoned on the basis of a conjecture that has no more authority associated with it, certainly no observational or scientific authority, no more authority than the particular argument advanced by a particular conjecturer. So I say again, there is this critique of method. And then not only is the method an introspective one, but rather bravely, the introspective proceeds to generalize his results to nothing less than the entire human population. As Reid says, no man has ever been able to set out for us distinctly and methodically all the operations of the thinking principle within himself. But if some philosopher did achieve this feat, this would reveal only the anatomy of one particular subject. And if applied to human nature in general, it would be both incomplete and wrong. For you don't have to think very hard to realize that the differences amongst human minds are greater than the differences amongst any other beings that we regard as belonging to the same species. We differ from each other more than cats differ from each other, he wants to say. In other words, the n equals 1 model is simply inapplicable in a domain like this. All right, who's the culprit then? Well, you can go all the way back to the ancients. Reid finds the most influential of the current culprits being Descartes. And about Descartes' position, he says this. Descartes wants us to think that he got out of all this craziness through this logical argument. Cogito, ergo, sum. But obviously, he was in his right mind all the time and never seriously doubted his own existence. That argument doesn't prove that his existence, it takes it for granted. I am thinking, he says, therefore I am. And isn't it just as good reasoning to say, I am sleeping, therefore I am, or I'm doing nothing, therefore I am. If a body moves, it must exist, no doubt. But if it is at rest, it must exist then too. Furthermore, supposing it has been proved that my thought and my consciousness must be had by something, and consequently that I exist, how do I know that all the series of thoughts that I remember belong to one subject, and that the I of this moment is the very same individual I of yesterday and of times past? Descartes didn't see fit to start this doubt, but Locke did. He's getting to Locke on personal identity. And in order to resolve it, he solemnly laid it down that personal identity consists in consciousness. That is, if you are conscious that you did X a year ago, this consciousness makes you the very same person that did X. And Reid says this is transparently preposterous. Madhouses all over the world are filled with people who will tell you to a moral certainty battles they lost a year ago and duels in which they suffered mortal death, etc. Some of them will have hands inside their jackets, lamenting their sad fate in Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo.
and wanting to know where their three-cornered hat went. But the fact that you recall having done something surely cannot be the basis upon which you've established that you did it. Now, all of this speculation on Reid's account finally leads to solipsism. As he says, Descartes, Malebranche, and Locke have all used their talents and skill to prove the existence of a material world, but with very little success. For these three great men, with the best goodwill, have not been able to draw from all the treasures of philosophy one argument that is fit to convince a thinking person of the existence of anything other than himself. This is an anticipation of something we find in Kant's Prolegomena and in the second edition of the first Critique of Pure Reason. What does Kant say the continuing scandal in philosophy is? That philosophers have been unable to establish the reality of the external world. This is precisely what this mediational ideal theory leads to. You simply do not have epistemic resources to get outside the narrow boundaries of your own conscious life. So for all you know, there isn't anything external to that, do you see? And Reid's point in defending common sense precepts is, if that's where philosophy wants to place its bets against the common sense understandings of the human race since a time out of memory, then they are on a collision course. And the consequence of this is that the most thinking parts of the world will come to regard philosophy as simply ridiculous.
Well, and with that line of thought, you start to think about the contemporary world and the conversation about transgenderism and, you know, various what we perceive as irrational phenomenon in our culture right now. And I think from this perspective, we could agree with Reid that if we are skeptical about the external reality and objects that we can see and experience, then we are on a crash course for humanity and coming to disastrous conclusions. And in a sense, I think that's true. Through rational means, and it's not like these progressive academics and universities aren't using their reason or their rational faculty, certainly not in accord with an orthodox phronema, but this utilization of rationality without bounds and this immense skepticism, which leads to postmodernism, that there are no universal truths, that there is no there to whether it be the external world or metaphysics or truth claims or knowledge or anything else, leads into a world in which everybody worships their own pleasure and believes that they can create their own truth. And from that perspective, Reid saw something, in the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, that is now in full fruition in our own culture.
So he is at much, and when he uses philosophy, he's talking about essentially a natural science approach to addressing problems. So what is the real theory, finally? It's the ideal theory, the theory that's central to David Hume's copy principle. And so we can ask, is it really the case that every simple idea is the copy of a simple impression? Or more generally, that the contents of thought are derived from impressions rather than from the facts of the external world?
Remember, when he says simple idea, this is coming out of Lockean philosophy. So for Locke, remember, we're a tabula rasa, and so simple impressions create simple ideas in the mind, of which the representations are what we directly engage with in regards to knowledge in the world itself. And then you have complex ideas like unicorns, right? So for Locke, unicorns and things that are created in the imagination, these are complex ideas that are built upon the simple idea of a horse, the simple idea of a horn, the simple idea of wings, that these are simple ideas that we observe, or they are simple impressions in which we've acquired, and then we can create complex ideas by mixing and matching these simple ideas. So what he's referring to in regards to Hume is Hume's application of Locke concerning ideas and representationalism.
World. The culprit, you see, is a radical empiricism that begins not with the nature of actual creatures, but with a theory. The nature of actual creatures is such that it requires us to understand what kind of adaptive mechanisms they have. If you think I'm reading a kind of Darwinian element into Reid's account, it's there. When Reid talks about the lowly caterpillar that crawls across 1,000 leaves until it finds the one that's right for its diet, do you think the caterpillar learned that there would be no caterpillars. For the amount of time it would take to learn which leaf is the right leaf, who's doing the teaching. Suppose you just happen to come across a bad run of leaves. Goodbye, caterpillar. So nature must fit creatures out with a readier means of adapting to the demands of the environment. It can't all be experiential. When Locke says, I answer in a word from experience, this simply won't work. You know, there's almost an anticipation of, oh my goodness, am I going to say this name? All right, with apologies. There's an anticipation of Freud in some of this. Look, when, oh dear me, you might be too young for this, I'm not sure. I'll take a chance. When Freud talks about the oral stage of psychosexual development, here's a question. He's a neurologist. He's well trained in the biological sciences. He knows it takes a lot of work to drain a bottle or a breast. In fact, many, many years later, into the middle of the 20th century, we actually developed strain gauges that you could put on the cheek of infants and calculate in ergs the amount of work it's taking to drain a bottle. Trust me, it's a lot. I mean, unless you're a brute for hard work, it's something you just give up on. You could try it now if you weren't afraid that your friends would laugh at you. Get yourself a bottle, fill it with warm milk, lie on it more or less flat on a pillow, and try to drain the thing. You're going to, sort of very difficult after a while. And you probably will raise a profound physiological question. How the hell do they do it? I mean, 3-4 times a day. Now, here are your choices. They've studied the metabolic physiology of human life. They know what their electrolyte requirements and vitamin D and so forth, what that's all about. And with reluctance, but with resolve, they say, I better drink that bottle. Not likely, all right? So how do we account for it? They like doing it. The oral stimulation is gratifying. The reason babies do all that work is because they derive pleasure from it. The Freudian account is that nature makes pleasurable what in fact is mandatory for survival. Sir Thomas Browne in Religio Medici, which is a great essay, you must read it. It's a wide-ranging essay. And then he gets to the question of human reproduction. And Browne writes magnificently. And he gives a characterization of the preposterous athletic undertakings required for procreation, the ridiculousness, the postural and acrobatic maneuvers. And he says, surely a providential and all-wise divinity could have contrived some less embarrassing and nonsensical means than this. Now, I think Thomas Browne had 9 children. He overcame his scruples, but again, what one is getting at is that nature predisposes actions of a certain kind by making the action itself pleasurable as the basis upon which the entity undertakes it in the first instance. Now, is that a return to innate ideas? No, it has nothing to do with ideas. Now let's take something more fit for the family hour. Language. What is the empiricist account of language? What's Locke's account of language? On what basis does this become spectacles? On what basis does this become pen? Well, by convention. That is to say, as a result of the way these things are used and as a result of our living in society, we reach a certain agreement that objects of a certain kind will be named. They will get certain names. They will be given a certain nominal essence. So an object of a certain kind that behaves in a certain way, particularly when you put it along white paper, capable of absorbing ink, and so that's the sort of thing which in a certain culture over a period of time has come to be referred to as a pen. Reid says this simply won't work. The word pen is an artificial term. Look here, I have to use audiovisual aids. Now you have to look at me very carefully. Right, watch this now. Pen. Does that have anything in common with this at all? There's nothing in common with it at all. So this is artificial. It's not like I am conveying the properties of the object in question. Now, in order for us to agree to enter into a covenant, a compact, such that henceforth, this sort of thing is what we call a pen. There must be some language in place that allows us to establish covenants and agreements. Do you see? Because unless we have some way of communicating with each other, our concurrence and our agreement, then no possible convention can be brought about. So there must be a natural language if there ever is to be an artificial.
What the heck?
Look at me very carefully. All right, watch this now. Sure. Now, in order for us to agree to enter into a covenant, a compact, such that henceforth, this sort of thing is what we call a pen. There must be some language in place that allows us to establish covenants and agreements. You see? Because unless we have some way of communicating with each other, our concurrence and our agreement, then no possible convention can be brought about. So there must be a natural language if there ever is to be an artificial language.
And in the beginning was the Word, right? So again, that appeal to language, and Hume appropriates these nominal essences. So, for example, this, what is this Topo Chico? What is the essence of water? What is the essence of this bottle? And you could come up with claims about containing liquids and all this stuff, but Hume would say, well, now it's a paperweight. Now it's a decoration. You know, there's nominal essences, nominal uses, and this is the difference between something like utilitarianism or deontological ethics coming out of Kant. For deontological ethics, it's about duties regardless of outcomes. Utilitarianism is not focused on intention of duties or fulfillment of moral duties. It's purely focused on the consequences. And so these are these two ethical systems, you know. Obviously, we're talking about Reid, but Kant's deontological ethics is all about the intention of the individual, regardless of the consequences. And utilitarianism is focused on purely the consequences and not interested in the intentions of the individual. Okay.
Reid puts it beautifully when he says, if there had never been an artificial language, I'm using an artificial language, words, grammar, you know, that sort of thing. If there had never been an artificial language, every man would be a dancer and a painter, do you see? That is, if you take a look at how pre-literate societies instruct their young, very often it is in the form of a dance. It's choreographed. Certain steps and procedures and values are conveyed in ways that can be perceived by creatures already tuned to this kind of information. So unless there is a natural language in place on which in scaffolding fashion you can hang an artificial language, the latter would never take place. Now, Reid wants this to be architectonic for much that goes into perception and cognition. There must be some natural system in place which takes inputs of a certain kind and from them generates information at the level at which creatures can use it. Now, what is that internal mechanism? When Locke refers to sensations, or Hume refers to perceptions, what is taking place when the external world delivers stimulation? What's taking place is the stimulation produces a natural sign. This is why I asked you to look at me. Look again. Sometimes you have to do audiovisual things twice, right? Look again. Watch. Pen. Nothing in common. Pen. Nothing in common. Now, how does this get into your agile, active system? It gets in there naturally by a process that we refer to as physiological. The cornea collects some of the light, it goes through the lens, it's delivered to the retina. The retina has cells that respond chemically. When a certain amount of photopigment is decomposed, a small DC signal is generated in the tail of the receptor cell. When that reaches a critical level, you start actually getting impulse activity in the optic nerve, which goes back to something called Meyer's loop, and et cetera, and the ball's in play. None of that has anything in common with this. So all of those natural responses to this, which Reid refers to as the natural signs, all of those natural signs excited by an object now somehow must be transposed into the thing signified, because what you are not seeing when I hold this up is activity in your visual system. You're not seeing photopigments being decomposed. You're not seeing electrical activity in your optic nerve fibers. If I may say so, you're seeing a pen. Now, Reid takes it as the quaestio vexata, how the system goes from the natural sign to the thing signified. That, he says, we do not know. Well, that was 1764. It's 2013. How do we go from physiological responses to the phenomenology of experience? I don't know. Do you? If you do, don't waste time in here. Get home, write it up, publish it, and invite me to the Nobel Prize banquet in your honor. Well, there aren't really qualia. Yeah, there really are qualia. Yes, I'm sorry about that. Yes, there are. For example, that panel of wall is red. Right. Now, why do I call it red? I'm a Reidian, all right? Why do I call it red? Because it's red. I shall get to that.
And this gets into even scientific so he's talking about the wall being red. Well, we can look at frequencies to decipher the differences in colors, right? Well, it is a cultural condition in which we describe that frequency as red, which he's highlighting. The word is different from the thing, but we're all looking at the thing and recognizing what it is. There's a direct awareness that is happening physiologically, is what he's talking about. And these are these natural signs, not innate ideas or not representations in the mind that Reid's trying to get at.
Now, if you follow Reid on the matter of natural signs and the problem of going from the natural sign to the thing signified, and how Reid's concept of a natural language being the necessary precondition for an artificial language, then you're ready for perhaps the most daunting chapter in the inquiry, a part of it that Hume admitted he had some trouble with. A lot of persons have had trouble with it ever since. The section referred to as the geometry of visibles. Now, this is a bit elaborate. I urge you to read Reid's account of it, but I think right now it might be of more benefit to listen than to write, because I'll probably speak about this more quickly than your note-taking. Here's the question before the House. When I look at an object that I am strongly inclined to regard as being in the external world, is the result of that inspection, the conscious result, an impression, an idea, a sensation? Or is it the registration of the object itself? That's the question. That's the question that's going to divide a realist, a Reidian realist, from a phenomenalist, a subjectivist, choose your word. All right. Here's the thought experiment. Imagine yourself positioned in the center of an indefinitely large sphere, such that your eye is at the absolute center of the sphere, on the outer surface of which can be projected any object that you like. All right? Now, one thing that's obvious is that anything you project onto the surface of the sphere, whatever the object is, will be curved by the contour of the sphere itself. So everything that you see on the surface of the sphere will be visibly curved. And in fact, if I were to project a straight edge onto the surface of the sphere, look here, that tangibly straight object would be visibly curved. There's an exception to this. If the projection is on any of the circumferential lines of the sphere, such that every point is the same distance from the retina itself, those objects will be visibly straight. So that even if they were curved on the surface, that is, even if they were tangibly curved, they will be perceived as visibly straight. This can be shown. All right, now we can take that arrangement and we can have one circumference clipped as to form the base of a triangle. You see where this is going, don't you? Now we can take another circumferential line and clip it so that it forms one of the sides. And we can take yet another circumferential line and clip it so that it forms the other side. So I now have something that is a visible rectilinear triangle, because as these are equatorial or circumferential lines, they're visibly straight. But what has actually been formed? A spherical triangle has been formed with some very interesting properties. Its angles sum to more than 180 degrees, for example. You following this? Just? When you read the chapter, you'll follow it more closely. You can do the same thing with circumferential lines to form visible straight lines. And in fact, you can do it in such a way as to form visibly straight, visibly parallel lines, which in fact tangibly will intersect at two loci. What he's doing is anticipating by about 70 years Riemannian geometry, a non-Euclidean geometry. There's controversy in the literature. Did Reid really anticipate Riemann? I shan't get into that. The correct answer to the question is yes, but it's a long story. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. Because he was very committed to mathematics. He knew what he was doing. Now, what's this all about? Right now, I would ask you to write something. I'd ask you to draw something. If you care to, you don't have to. But if you try to draw as good a right-angle triangle as you can, just don't shake. Don't need a ruler, but do it as best you can. You can look on. That's right. You can look on his. You don't all have to do it. All right. So there, he's looking on yours. He's investigating with a certain authority on this. All right. The answer to the question is, how does that project itself onto your visual system? Is spherically. Now, when you look at it, what do you see? You see a rectilinear triangle. In other words, you don't see the impression. You don't see the copy of an impression. You see the object. Now, is this the experimentum crucis? Reid doesn't regard this as an experimentum crucis. Reid regards this as a way of illustrating how you actually prosecute the scientific agenda when the question before the House is, in what way are the events in the external world represented in mental life? You actually have to do something to answer a question like that. You've got to go beyond sitting around and thinking hard about it. You know what I mean? I mean, thinking really, wasn't David Hume brilliant? Yes, he was. That's not enough. In fact, if you're less clever, you're likely to work a little harder at it. I'm going to offer you a quite modern version of the same story, because I think if I cast it in later 20th century terms, it might actually be more accessible to you. The projection of any stimulus on the retina is very noisy, because the medium through which light passes from the external world to the retina is dispersive. The light is spread out. So in fact, if you plotted the actual radiation reaching the retina as a function of location, where the stimulus is aimed at the fovea, you'd get something like a normal distribution of luminances because of the optical spread. How's the system designed? Why is it that when I present a point source, you see a point source and not some smudge? Because optically, it is smudged. Well, the reason you don't see a smudge and you do see a point is this. The system is arranged in such a way that a region of greater activity will initiate inhibitory effects on its near neighbors. So that, in fact, the region that is maximally stimulated by the light will inhibit retinal cells adjacent to it that are less stimulated. In other words, you get a physiological, by way of inhibition, you get a physiologically cleaned up signal from what begins as an optically noisy signal. The last one on Earth in the 18th century who would have been surprised by findings like that would be Reid. This is precisely what he's getting at. The system must be designed in such a way as to achieve these adaptations without benefit of reflection, thought, philosophical enlightenment, etc. Now, finally, I want you to come to terms with how Reid's term common sense should be understood, because it's very easily misunderstood. In the Prolegomena, when Kant wants to make clear the great respect he has for Hume, well, part of the way he makes the point is by saying how foolish it was for people like, quote, Reid, Oswald, and Beattie to think that they could defeat something like Hume by appealing to no more than the wisdom of the herd. Now, a Reidian principle of common sense is not mob rule. In fact, one of the early translations of Reid's inquiry, anonymously translated into German, if this had been my translation, I wouldn't have put.
Now listen, because the reason why I wanted to play this is Dan Robinson is giving the rebuttal to Greg Bonson's. If remember the video before, Greg Bonson, he was claiming the same thing, that this is just a consensus to the collectivity of human experience, which is a poor rational argument for these common sense natural beliefs. Dan Robinson is going to say he's going to rebut that criticism. So listen.
I name on it either. Renders common sense gemeiner Menschenverstand, like a common criminal, you know, there's sort of the common run of understanding. Reid tells us what he means by a principle of common sense. If there are core precepts that we are under a necessity to take for granted, we are under it's not chosen, it's not opinion, it's not a voice vote, it certainly isn't mob rule. If there are fundamental precepts that we are under an obligation to take for granted in all of the ordinary conduct of life, that up is not down, black is not white, if they are in place, these, he said, are what I call a principle of common sense. And what opposes these is quite literally nonsense. It would be a sign of a kind of disordered mind. Yes, I can show you people who are firmly convinced that the thoughts they're having are actually someone else's. We generally increase the medication when that happens. We do not redo philosophy of mind. So I would say at the end of the first encounter, at least on the question of the ideal theory and the notion of our access to the external world, our direct access being blocked by the organs of mediation, the Reidian account, I believe, is successful as a criticism of method and is highly suggestive at the level of relevant evidence over and against an ideal theory for which there isn't evidence. Now, the kind of evidence you might think works in its behalf is the evidence from illusion. And Reid is very good on that, and I shall be covering some of that week after next. But when you read the chapter, you'll see that suppose you're looking at a white rose and you put on red-tinted glasses, you don't think the color of the rose has changed. Of course, the condition of the visual system affects how things appear. How do we know that? We know that because we have veridical perception when these things are not laboring against us, do you see? Every person knows that if he's got a bilious disease, things normally tasting sweet now taste bitter. Why? Because the bile titer in the circulation is way up. Get your gallbladder checked, that sort of thing. Now, if in fact you were victims, if you were hostage to every transitory change in stimuli in the external world, well, understand, not only is everything in the external world constantly changing in one way or another, but so are we. Cells are dying, new cells are coming about. I mean, if this were the level at which conscious life had to be lived, it would be unlivable. And that's Reid on the ideal theory. I shall see you in a week.
So that kind of concludes the Dan Robinson response. And that's why I wanted to play it, is because he's clearly Steelmanning Thomas Reid in the Scottish Common Sense Realism, even though he himself has his own disagreements, but he was one of the few people I could find that's really Steelmanning. Now, again, in regards to education, if you just want to learn about Scottish realism, I highly recommend going and watching this Arthur Holmes and going through his history of philosophy. Like I said, for the umpteenth time, this is a phenomenal series in philosophy. As you can see, I've watched the vast multitude of these. And this is basically an introduction to philosophy course for us plebs who are not in an undergraduate program to ask the professor to enlighten us with all this stuff. So do check that out. And if you want that link to Dan Robinson's series, again, we just watched video 2 out of 8. And I chose that one because it's directly talking about Reid's rebuttal to the representationalism or ideal theory. And yeah, and the last thing here that I didn't mention that I had in some of my notes that I thought might be useful is Reid's foundationalist response to ethics, because he's if we can't know the external world, how do we come to moral objectives and moral principles that are universal? For Hume, we don't. their cultural conventions, their social habits, just like we have our own personal habits, our mental habits. We have sense impression, and then we have our representational ideas. And as I said, Reid is a foundationalist. So he believes in these first principles, and he believes that ethics, like any science, has its first principles. Now, Hume rejects ethics being scientific in any way. And Reid argues that they are these ethical first principles. And in a way, the Kant in his moral imperatives, talking about the deontological ethics, the categorical imperative of Kant is getting at a way to argue for a universal truth. And he argues, based on the categorical imperative, that if you do something and you expand that universally, is it beneficial or is it negative to other persons, around you or even yourself? And if it is detrimental, well, then it violates a moral universal principle. Now, Reid is saying they are self-evident first principle, ethical first principles to everyone. And this is what part of his humor, to anybody who has a conscience, who takes the pains to exercise it, right? So he's saying, okay, Hume is saying that there are no ethical principles, or there is no moral objective. And he's saying anybody who has a conscience and takes the pains to actually exercise their conscience knows that there has to be ethical and moral first principles. And he says that we have natural desires and passions that fit us for a moral life. He calls these natural inclinations, in that there's an intention of nature. Now, remember, as Dan Robinson just highlighted, for Reid, he uses nature and God interchangeably in many ways, but he says that nature gives us that there are axioms that lead to social virtue and good government, and that conscience is the law of God written on the heart of man, and that is sufficient to provide what he calls intuitive evidence of ethics. We have an intuitive evidence through our conscience that is written on our heart by God. This is Thomas Reid's argument. And one cannot disobey this intuitive evidence without acting unnaturally. So he, again, and this is very Christian, you can see that sin or the violation of these ethical principles is an unnatural act. That's what he's claiming. Moral judgment grows from imperceptible seeds planted in man by the Creator. This is Thomas Reid. And by an impulse of nature, we judge for ourselves. So he says that some things merit approval and some merit blame. This is his understanding of right and wrong, and that we ought to use the best means we can to be informed of our moral duty. You can already see, now he's writing this before Kant, but you could see where Kant is going as well. And so read on Hume's theory of ideas of ethical subjectivism leads to no objectivity for Reid. He's saying he has no objectivity for beauty or morality, which I think Hume to some degree would agree with. And that feeling and judgment are inseparable in moral approval, that we have an emotive and we have a rational means for ethical judgment. And Reid, the rational judgment is not just about facts. That's what Hume claimed, that we just have rational judgments that are based on sort of, again, not facts and an ultimate truth claim, but again, these sense impressions. And this is the empirical approach to consequence, where reason, according to Reid, and this is what even aligns with our Orthodox worldview, reason goes beyond facts and explores the relationship between ideas, between signs, right? So reason is not for Reid, the signs that are implanted in our mind. Again, remember Dan Robinson, Dr. Robinson's use of pin and the language pin, and that he's saying this is a natural physiological sign that emerges in the mind of man. Reid is saying reason is about the utilization and the understandings of how these signs interact. And that this is a principle. We should prefer a greater good to a less good. Moral judgments are real judgments based on real intuitive principles. And so that was one section that I hadn't addressed in regards to Reid's ethics and how he's responding to the ethical subjectivism of David Hume. So anyways, guys, that's going to conclude, 3 hours. I knew this was going to be a long one. that's going to conclude our stream today on Scottish realism. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anybody's super chat. Smash that like. Do you guys find this stream useful? I know, again, a lot of these philosophy streams, they tend not to be the most popular of my content, but I think they're really useful. I love diving into intellectual history and seeing how, ideas relate, philosophical projects or responding to other philosophical projects, and really how we get to where we're at now in 2025. And so, yeah. John of Damascus says, have a good one, DPH. Pix 180 says, thanks for the stream. Interesting one. Thank you very much, guys. I do appreciate that. Vigo says, great stream. Thank you. Do appreciate that. Let me check if anybody's sent anything in on Dono chat. Oh, Spirited sends in a generous $20 and says, got to go back and catch this one. But last stream was great dealing with the wimpy prots. May God continue to bless you and your family and your work. Well, thank you so much, Spirit, and God bless you, brother. Really appreciate that support. And let me see if anything came in on Streamlabs. So again, we try to hit on the big points, the central points of Scottish realism. It's a perceptual presentation. It's a presentational perception. These are real perceptions of the external world. They're not representations, as the Locke, Berkeleyan, and Hume tradition would argue. It is an epistemological monism is what Reid is going for. It's these common sense natural beliefs, which include the laws of logic, mathematics, the existence of nature, material objects, causal connections, memory, free will, moral principles. These are natural beliefs that are imbued upon us by our Creator. This is what Reid is arguing, and that we come to real natural beliefs through the way that we're constituted. And he argues, again, like Descartes, somebody who would be skeptical of their own existence, that this is a physiological or a psychological problem of somebody that is doing philosophy by sitting in an armchair, and that philosophy needs to have some type of experimental or provable methods, and that he's arguing that all these philosophers, what they're doing, and he's really responding again to Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, is that it's all theory laden. What's the practice of all this stuff? The whole hard problem, remember, that Kant was saying, is that all these philosophers are skeptical of the external world. And Reid's saying that is ridiculous. We do not live and act based on a total skepticism of the external world. And if you did, you are probably mentally crazy. And the problem is that philosophy is being done in people in armchairs, closing their eyes and coming up with theories about how the world works. And in so doing, deny any possibility of objective knowledge claims, objective morality, objective ethics. And so, but at the same time, some of the shortcomings of the Scottish realism is that it's basically supplanting dogmatic traditional metaphysics with these common sense first principles, these natural beliefs. Another shortcoming is that he's not explicit about the appeal to revelation. Thomas Reid is playing the game of the Enlightenment and focusing on rationalism, empiricism, and for the Scottish Enlightenment, education. So if I think his paradigm, the school of philosophical thought, would be so much stronger if he just began, as the Orthodox worldview does, begin with divine revelation, appeal then to faith, and then appeal to reason, and do so in that order, so that the paradigm of the biblical construction of man and the way that we relate to creation and the Creator is already framing the contours of the utilization of reason itself. Even though there's so much that we talked about with Scottish realism that in many regards that we would agree with. And so the last point is that Reid was also responding, and he believes in human freedom. This whole debate with Hume regarding causation or the ability to know causation, Reid is saying that I, as a human acting causal agent, I can choose to do something. And from this perspective, whether the world is whether we have free will or determinism is really, he's arguing, because Hume says that well, here I'll read what Hume basically says. While we have knowledge of necessary connections between things, the constant conjunctions of the same pairs of things, the antecedent, the consequence, right, the causal relation, the temporal causal relationship, leads us to believe in causal connection. So we have a belief in causal connection, but that's not provable. And Hume argues then, given that such causal connections are agreed upon by both those who promote free will, human freedom, and those who promote a deterministic universe, if two opposing worldviews agree on these principles, he says there's no choice between the two. It doesn't matter. And Reid is saying, well, let's just agree that both the free will school and the determinist school are saying that there are causal relationships within the world. Reid responds by saying that human agency is the distinctive reason for how we know that there is a knowable and a first cause and a causal relationship between the external world, because I myself can decide to kick something. I myself can make an emotional judgment. I can make a rational judgment. I can choose which clothes I'm going to put on. And Hume responds by saying freedom is not an act, or freedom is to act, not freedom of choice, and confusion between actions and motives. So he's saying, okay, Reid, well, you can have freedom to act in a certain way, but you don't have freedom to of choice. And that Hume's saying there's a confusion between actions and motives. And Reid's response is that freedom is to choose whether something happens or not. That freedom is not an act of reasoning. Freedom is not just motivation. Freedom of choice is between alternative reasons and motives. Whether reasons or motives are determined, we have direct awareness to choose between them, and there arises our natural beliefs in human freedom. And so that's Reid's logical argument against Hume concerning whether we have actual free will and human freedom. So anyways, that's going to do it. Major appreciation to everybody who supported my stream today and my work. God bless you guys. And I think the next stream we'll be doing is another sponsored stream. A major thank you again goes out to AC. I thought this was a great topic, one that I wouldn't have actually thought about performing a full stream on, but I think it was a great topic. And I want to thank AC again for your support and for sponsoring so many streams. And the next one will be another sponsored stream comparing Orthodoxy and Confucianism. So we had somebody who wants to hear a little bit more about Confucianism and its relationship to an Orthodox paradigm and where they agree and where they disagree. So that's going to be the next stream. And so anyways, guys, thank you so much for the support. God bless you all. I greatly appreciate it. And I will see you all in the next one. As always, until then, God bless.